Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Ella Marsh rolled down her car window, letting the crisp autumn air fill the vehicle as she drove through Brookhaven for the first time. The neighborhood was postcard perfect. Tree-lined streets, neatly trimmed lawns, and houses painted in warm, inviting colors. It was the kind of place she had always imagined settling into, far removed from the chaos of city life. Her GPS chirped, indicating a right turn onto Sycamore Lane. There it was, her new home, a charming two-story house with a wraparound porch and ivy climbing the brick walls. Ella parked in the driveway, stepping out to admire the place she'd worked so hard to call her own. The movers were due to arrive later that afternoon, but for now, she had the house to herself. Fresh start, she murmured to herself, clutching the key in her hand. As she opened the front door, the house greeted her with a faint creak. The air inside smelled faintly of wood polish and something she couldn't quite place, a faint trace of age, perhaps. Ella wandered through the empty rooms, envisioning where her furniture would go. The living room had a beautiful bay window that overlooked the street, and the kitchen, though dated, had a cozy charm she found endearing. After a quick tour, Ella stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee. She waved at a young couple walking their dog, who waved back with friendly smiles. Across the street, a group of children were playing tag, their laughter echoing down the lane. Everything felt so idyllic, so perfect. But as Ella's gaze wandered, she noticed something odd. A house at the far end of the street looked different. The lawn was overgrown, the windows dark, and the mailbox leaned at an odd angle. It was the only house on the block that seemed neglected. Before she could dwell on it, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You must be new here." Ella turned to see an elderly woman standing at the edge of her porch. She was petite, with sharp blue eyes and a cane that she leaned on heavily. "I'm Ella," she said, offering a smile. "Just moved in today." The woman nodded. "I'm Mrs. Grayson. Lived here longer than anyone else on this street. Welcome to Brookhaven." "Thank you. It's beautiful here," Ella said, glancing back at the overgrown house. "Though, I couldn't help but notice that one house looks a little abandoned." Mrs. Grayson's expression darkened. She followed Ella's gaze and shook her head. "That's the old Miller house. Been empty for years. Best to leave it alone." "Why's that?" Ella asked, curious. Mrs. Grayson hesitated, her fingers tightening around the handle of her cane. "Sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions, dear. Just enjoy your new home." Before Ella could press further, Mrs. Grayson turned and walked away, her cane tapping against the pavement. Ella watched her go, unease creeping into her chest. The first few days in Brookhaven passed uneventfully. Ella unpacked her belongings, arranged her furniture, and started to settle into her new routine. Her neighbors, David and Claire Rodriguez, stopped by with a welcome basket of baked goods and a bottle of wine. Their two children, Sophia and Max, played in the yard while the adults chatted. "It's such a friendly neighborhood," Claire said. "You'll love it here." Ella smiled. It already feels like home. As the days turned into a week, Ella began to notice small inconsistencies. On her morning jog, she passed the Miller house again. This time, the mailbox was gone, and the grass seemed taller. She could have sworn there had been curtains in the windows before, but now they were bare. When she mentioned it to Claire, her neighbor frowned. "The Miller house?" she asked, tilting her head. "I don't think there's a house there. That lot's been empty for as long as I can remember." Ella blinked. "No, it's definitely there. It's the last house on the left." Claire gave her a puzzled look, but shrugged. "Maybe you're thinking of a different street?" The conversation left Ella unsettled. That evening, she stood on her porch, staring at the Miller house. It was still there, just as she remembered, but something about it felt off. The air around it seemed heavier, as if the house were holding its breath. A movement in the shadows caught her eye. A tall, thin figure stood near the edge of the property, barely visible in the fading light. Ella squinted, trying to make out the details, but the figure melted into the darkness before she could get a good look. That night, Ella found it hard to sleep. The Miller house lingered in her mind like a half-remembered dream. She tossed and turned, her thoughts cycling through Claire's strange reaction and Mrs. Grayson's ominous warning. Why would people pretend the house wasn't there? What were they hiding? Just as Ella began to drift off, a faint noise pulled her back to wakefulness. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, a faint whispering sound. She sat up in bed, straining to hear. The sound seemed to be coming from outside. Ella slipped out of bed and moved to the window. The street was dark and still, the only light coming from the faint glow of the lampposts. But as her eyes adjusted, she noticed something peculiar. The Miller house was faintly illuminated, as though a light was flickering inside. Her heart quickened. She had been sure the house was abandoned. Grabbing her robe, Ella crept downstairs and stepped out onto the porch. The cool night air prickled her skin as she stared at the house. The flickering light seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat, visible through the cracked windows. A low creak startled her. She turned sharply, but there was nothing there, just the empty street and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Shaking her head, she decided to go back inside. Whatever was happening, she would figure it out in the morning. The next morning, Ella couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Over breakfast, she debated whether to mention the strange flickering light to anyone. She didn't want to seem paranoid or, worse, like the new neighbor who couldn't mind her own business. But the more she thought about it, the more she felt compelled to investigate. Ella decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear her head. As she passed the Miller house, she slowed her pace. In the daylight, the house looked even more decrepit than before. The shutters hung crooked, and the paint on the siding had peeled away almost entirely. Yet there was something undeniably magnetic about it. Her eyes were drawn to the front door, which seemed to lean slightly ajar. She hesitated, glancing up and down the street. No one was around, and the air was eerily quiet. Before she could talk herself out of it, Ella stepped onto the cracked walkway leading to the house. Her sneakers crunched against the gravel as she approached the porch. The closer she got, the more she noticed the strange details. Symbols carved into the wooden railing, faint scratch marks on the doorframe, and an odd, metallic smell that hung in the air. She reached for the door, but stopped when a voice called out behind her. Startled, she turned to see Claire hurrying toward her, a look of concern etched across her face. "What are you doing?" Claire asked, her tone sharp. Ella stepped back from the porch, feeling caught. I thought I saw something here last night. A light. I just wanted to check it out." Claire's expression softened, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Fear, maybe. "You shouldn't be here," she said firmly. "The Miller house. It's not safe." "What? What's going on with it?" Ella asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "Everyone keeps acting like it doesn't exist, but it's right here." Claire glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "Look, it's complicated. Just trust me, okay? Stay away from this place." Before Ella could press her further, Claire grabbed her arm and steered her back toward the sidewalk. "Come on, let's get out of here." That evening, Ella couldn't stop replaying the encounter with Claire. Her neighbor's reaction only deepened her curiosity. Why was everyone so afraid of the Miller house? And what had Claire meant by "it's not safe"? Determined to find answers, Ella decided to do some research. She pulled out her laptop and started searching for any information she could find about Brookhaven and the Miller house. At first, there was nothing unusual, just old property records and generic information about the neighborhood's history. But as she dug deeper, she stumbled across a series of old news articles that made her blood run cold. The first article, dated nearly 20 years ago, detailed the disappearance of a young boy named Tommy Calloway. According to the report, Tommy had been playing outside with friends when he wandered off toward the Miller house. He was never seen again. Ella clicked on another article, this one from 5 years later. It described the vanishing of a teenage girl, Rachel Lynn, who had reportedly been dared by friends to spend the night in the Miller house. Her parents found her backpack on the porch the next morning, but Rachel was gone without a trace. Article after article followed the same pattern. People disappearing, all tied to the Miller house. And then abruptly, the report stopped. It was as if the house had been erased from public record. Ella leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. She glanced out the window toward the Miller house, its shadowy outline barely visible in the fading light. Whatever was happening in Brookhaven, it was clear the Miller house was at the center of it. Ella barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, set her nerves on edge. The weight of the article she had read pressed heavily on her mind. She couldn't shake the thought of Tommy Calloway, Rachel Lynn, and the others who had vanished. Their names swirled in her thoughts, blending with the eerie image of the Miller house. Around midnight, she finally gave up on trying to sleep and went downstairs to make herself a cup of tea. The kitchen was dimly lit, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. As she poured water into the kettle, a sudden chill swept through the room. Ella shivered and pulled her robe tighter around herself. Then she heard it, a faint whisper. Her breath caught in her throat as she froze, straining to listen. At first, she thought it might be the wind, but the sound was unmistakable, a voice, low and urgent, coming from outside. She moved to the window, her heart pounding. The street outside was still and empty, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. But as she stared out, the whisper came again, louder this time. "Ida." She stumbled back from the window, her hands gripping the counter for support. Her mind raced. Had she imagined it? Was she losing her grip on reality? But no, she had heard it clear as day. Someone or something had called her name. For a long moment, she stood frozen in the kitchen, every nerve in her body on high alert. Then, against her better judgment, she grabbed her phone and stepped out onto the porch. The cool night air hit her like a slap, and she wrapped her arms around herself as she scanned the street. The Miller house loomed at the end of the block, its dark silhouette almost blending into the night. Ella's gaze locked onto it, and a shiver ran down her spine. The voice had come from that direction. She was sure of it. She took a tentative step forward, then another, her slippers crunching softly against the gravel. The air felt heavier with each step, as though she were walking into a different world. When she reached the edge of her property, she stopped, her eyes fixed on the Miller house. It was completely still, the windows dark and lifeless. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" For a moment, there was no response. Then, just as she was about to turn back, the front door of the Miller house creaked open. Ella's breath caught in her throat. She stood frozen, staring at the gaping doorway. The darkness inside seemed to pulse, beckoning her forward. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up, and she found herself walking toward the house, drawn by some invisible force. When she reached the porch, she hesitated. The door was open just enough to reveal a sliver of the interior, dark and uninviting. A faint, metallic smell wafted out, making her stomach churn. "Who's there?" she called again, her voice barely above a whisper. The only response was silence. Ella's fingers trembled as she reached for the door, pushing it open wider. The hinges groaned in protest, and the darkness inside seemed to swallow the faint light from the street. She stepped inside, her heart hammering in her chest. The air was cold and damp, and the metallic smell was stronger now, mingling with the faint scent of decay. Ella fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a dusty, decrepit interior. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floorboards creaked under her weight. "Hello," she called again, her voice echoing through the empty house. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. Ella spun around, her flashlight darting wildly across the room. The door was closed, and no amount of pulling on the handle would budge it. Panic surged through her as she banged on the door, shouting for help. But the house seemed to absorb her cries, the silence pressing in on her like a suffocating blanket. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, she heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, as though something was moving toward her. Ella's flashlight trembled in her hand as she turned toward the sound. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice whispered from the darkness, so close it felt like it was right next to her ear. "Welcome home." Ella's scream tore through the silence, echoing off the rotting walls. She stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking wildly in her hand. The beam of light swept across the room, revealing only peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Her breathing came in short, panicked gasps. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "This isn't happening." But the house disagreed. The whispering returned, this time louder and more distinct. It wasn't one voice, it was many, overlapping and indistinct, like a chorus of distant murmurs. They filled the air, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ella clapped her hands over her ears, but it did little to muffle the sound. "Get out," one voice hissed, cutting through the others. Her legs finally obeyed her, and she bolted toward the door, yanking at the handle with all her strength. It refused to budge. She slammed her fists against it, tears streaming down her face. "Let me out," she screamed. Behind her, the tapping resumed. Slow and deliberate, it echoed through the house, each step closer than the last. Ella whirled around, her flashlight casting long, flickering shadows. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "What do you want?" The tapping stopped again, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the far corner of the room, something moved. It was subtle at first, a ripple in the shadows, but as Ella focused her light, she saw it clearly. A figure stood there, impossibly tall and thin, its face obscured by the darkness. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, as if studying her. Ella stumbled backward, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to warp and shimmer, as though reality itself were bending to its presence. "Stay away," she choked out, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to dissolve into the shadows, its form melting into the darkness until it was gone. But the oppressive feeling in the air remained, heavy and suffocating. Ella didn't wait to see if it would return. She turned and bolted toward the staircase, her only thought to get away from whatever was in the house. The stairs groaned under her weight as she climbed, her flashlight bouncing wildly with each step. At the top of the stairs, she found herself in a long hallway lined with doors. Most were closed, their paint chipped and peeling, but one stood slightly ajar. A faint light flickered from within, casting a soft glow onto the hallway floor. Ella hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But the pull of curiosity was stronger. She crept toward the open door, her footsteps barely making a sound. As she reached the threshold, she pushed the door open with trembling fingers. The room inside was small and sparsely furnished, with a single wooden chair in the center. On the floor in front of the chair was a circle of symbols drawn in what looked like dry blood. Candles lined the edges of the circle, their flames flickering unnaturally, though there was no breeze. On the chair sat a photograph. Ella approached cautiously, her heart pounding. She reached out and picked it up, holding it under the beam of her flashlight. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a picture of her house. Not the house she had just moved into, but the one she had grown up in, the small, blue house where she had spent her childhood. The photograph was old and faded, but there was no mistaking it. Her family's car was parked in the driveway, and the curtains in the windows were the same floral pattern her mother had loved. Ella's hands shook as she turned the photograph over. Scrawled on the back in jagged handwriting were the words, "You've always been here." A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. Ella's flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. The whispering returned, louder and more insistent, and this time, it was coming from all around her. She backed away, clutching the photograph to her chest. "What do you want from me?" she cried, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. The answer came, clear and chilling, in a voice that seemed to echo from the very walls. Everything. Ella's scream was swallowed by the darkness. The whispering voices swirled around her, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of warnings, pleas, and something more sinister, laughter. Cold, hollow laughter that sent ice down her spine. She fumbled with her flashlight, her fingers shaking so badly that she nearly dropped it. The device flickered once, then twice, before finally flaring back to life. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the empty room once more. The candles were nothing but melted wax puddles, the symbols on the floor now barely visible. But the photograph was still in her hands. Ella turned it over again, as if expecting the words to have changed. "You've always been here." The jagged handwriting remained, taunting her. Her mind raced. How could a picture of her childhood home be here, in this house? How did someone know about her past? Was this some elaborate prank? Or was it something worse? Something she couldn't explain? A sudden pounding at the front door made her jump. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the house like a war drum. Bang, bang, bang. Ella bolted for the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste. She reached the bottom landing just as the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she had nowhere to go. If she opened the door, what would she find waiting for her? Taking a deep breath, she reached out and gripped the doorknob. It was ice cold beneath her fingers. Slowly, she turned it and pulled the door open. No one was there. The street outside was eerily quiet. The warm glow of the streetlights cast long, empty shadows across the pavement. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. Ella exhaled sharply, her breath visible in the cold air. Maybe she had imagined the knocking. Maybe she was just sleep-deprived and letting her mind play tricks on her. Then she saw it. At the end of the street, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, stood the same tall, thin figure from before. It was motionless, its head tilted at that unnatural angle, as if watching her. Ella's breath caught in her throat. Her body screamed at her to run, to get inside and lock the door. But she couldn't move. The figure took a step forward. Ella stumbled back, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths as she pressed her back against the wood, her pulse hammering in her ears. The whispering had returned. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from inside her own head. Ella squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands against her ears as the whispering grew louder. It slithered through her mind like a living thing, each syllable crawling beneath her skin. "You've always been here. You belong to us. Stay," she gasped, shaking her head violently. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You're not real. You're not real." But the voice inside her mind only chuckled, a low, guttural sound that made her stomach twist. The house had taken on a new kind of silence, one that felt heavier than before. The air was thick, suffocating. The walls seemed closer, the shadows darker. Ella forced herself to move. She needed to get out, needed fresh air, needed a sound stopped her. A slow, deliberate creak from the floor above. Her breath hitched. Someone was upstairs. Her flashlight flickered again, and she tightened her grip, her knuckles turning white. She turned toward the staircase, every step forward feeling like a step deeper into something she couldn't escape. Another creak. Ella swallowed hard and climbed the stairs, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. As she reached the second floor, she saw it. The door at the end of the hall, the one that had been open before, was now shut. She had left it open. She was sure of it. The whispering returned, this time coming from behind the door. Ella's fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. She hesitated, a voice in her own mind screaming at her to turn around and run. But something else, something deeper, something that didn't quite feel like her, pushed her forward. She turned the knob. The door swung open with a groan. Inside, the room was empty except for a mirror. It stood in the center of the room, old and ornate, its glass surface warped and clouded with age. But as Ella stepped closer, her own reflection came into view. She gasped. The woman staring back at her wasn't her. She looked the same brown eyes, same long dark hair, but her expression was wrong. Too still, too knowing. And then, slowly, the reflection smiled. Ella did not. She stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking. The reflection lifted a hand, pressing it against the glass. Ella's stomach dropped as she realized. The handprint was on her side of the mirror, and then the whispering turned into a single, chilling word. Run. Ella's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Her reflection, no, the thing pretending to be her, pressed its hand harder against the glass. The pressure left an imprint, a smudge of condensation that shouldn't have been possible. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. She watched frozen as the reflection's smile widened, too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face. Then it whispered, "You've always been here." Ella stumbled back, her foot catching on the warped floorboards. She barely had time to brace herself before crashing to the ground, her flashlight skidding across the room. It spun wildly, casting erratic beams of light against the walls. When she looked up, the mirror had changed. It no longer reflected the room she was in. Instead, it showed something else somewhere else. A house. Not the Miller house, but another place entirely. A house with blue shutters and a white picket fence. A house she knew. Her childhood home. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible." The image in the mirror flickered like an old film reel, distorting and twisting. And then a figure appeared in the reflection. A little girl. Ella's stomach lurched. She recognized the child immediately. It was her at 6 years old. The girl stood in the front yard of the house, clutching a stuffed rabbit to her chest. Her small face was pale, her eyes wide and fearful. The whispering returned, but this time it was coming from the mirror itself. The words were garbled, layered over one another, but one phrase stood out clearly. "It's happening again." Ella scrambled to her feet, her pulse hammering in her ears. The reflection shifted again, and the little girl turned her head, looking directly at her. Ella's breath hitched. The child lifted a hand and pointed. Not at the house, not at the mirror, at something behind Ella. A floorboard creaked. Ella spun around, her heart slamming against her ribs. The room was empty, but the air had changed. It was heavier, charged with something unseen, but undeniably present. Slowly, she turned back to the mirror. The reflection was gone. The mirror now showed only her own face, pale, wide-eyed, trembling. But something was off. She lifted a hand. Her reflection did not. Ella let out a strangled gasp and lunged for the flashlight. As soon as her fingers wrapped around it, the mirror shattered. A deafening crack split the air as shards of glass exploded outward, forcing Ella to throw herself to the floor. Tiny fragments rained down around her, some slicing into her skin. Silence followed. Ella remained on the ground, her chest heaving, her hands shaking. Then a whisper, not from the mirror, from the doorway. "He's coming." Ella's body went rigid at the sound of the whisper. It came from the doorway, soft, distant, but unmistakably real. She forced herself to turn her head. The hallway beyond the room was pitch black. Her flashlight, now dim and flickering, barely cut through the darkness. The house felt suffocating, as if it were closing in around her. Then she saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hall. Tall, thin, motionless. It stood just beyond the reach of her flashlight's beam, its features obscured by shadow. But she could feel its eyes on her, watching, waiting. Her breath hitched. "He's coming." The whisper came again, but this time, it was inside her head. Ella scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the shattered glass. She had to get out. Now! She grabbed the flashlight and bolted from the room, her feet pounding against the wooden floor. The hallway stretched longer than she remembered, the walls seeming to shift and warp as she ran. The figure didn't move, but the shadows around it did. They twisted and curled, reaching for her like grasping fingers. The air grew colder with every step she took, her breath visible in the dim light. Ella's mind screamed at her to look away, to not acknowledge it, but she couldn't. As she neared the stairs, the figure finally moved. A slow, deliberate tilt of its head. Ella didn't wait to see what it would do next. She tore down the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste. The house groaned around her, the walls trembling as if they were alive. She reached the front door and yanked at the handle. Locked. No, 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 she gasped, twisting it violently. A deep, guttural sound filled the air. Laughter, low and distorted, it vibrated through the walls, through her bones. Ella spun around, pressing her back against the door. The figure was at the top of the stairs now, still watching. But it wasn't alone. More shadows gathered behind it, shifting and writhing. Whispering, the house was full of them. Ella slammed her fists against the door. Help, she screamed. Somebody help me. No answer. The laughter grew louder. Then a click. The door unlocked. Ella didn't hesitate. She wrenched it open and stumbled outside, nearly collapsing onto the porch. The cold night air hit her like a wave, shocking her system back to reality. The street was empty, silent. She turned back toward the house. The figure was gone. The doorway behind her was nothing but darkness. The house stood still, quiet, as if nothing had happened. Ella's pulse thundered in her ears. She stepped backward, her body trembling. Then she noticed something. The porch light, which had been on when she arrived, was now flickering. And just before it went out completely, she saw it, a single handprint pressed against the inside of the glass. Not hers, someone else's. Ella stumbled down the porch steps, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold night air burned her lungs, but she didn't care. She needed distance, space between her and that house. But even as she moved, the weight of unseen eyes pressed against her back. She reached the sidewalk, her legs weak beneath her. The street was eerily silent. The houses that had once felt so warm and inviting now loomed in the darkness, their windows black and empty. Something was wrong. The neighborhood was too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of traffic, just silence. Ella turned back to the house. The porch light had died completely, leaving the doorway in total darkness. But the handprint on the glass was still there. And then a shadow moved behind it. Ella choked back a scream. She spun on her heel and ran. Her bare feet pounded against the pavement as she sprinted down Sycamore Lane. The night stretched endlessly ahead of her, the streetlights flickering as she passed beneath them. She needed help. Claire, David, anyone. She reached the Rodriguez's house and slammed her fist against the door. Claire, David, please open up. No answer. She pounded harder, her panic rising. Please, I need help. The house remained dark. No movement inside. No sign of life. Ella's stomach twisted. This wasn't right. She turned to the next house and tried again. Nothing. Every house on the street was silent. Dark. Empty. It was as if the entire neighborhood had vanished. A cold realization settled over her. She was alone. A sharp whisper cut through the silence. You've always been alone. Ella whirled around. The voice had come from behind her, close. Too close. Her breath caught in her throat. The Miller house. It was no longer dark and abandoned. The windows were glowing, not with warm, inviting light, but with something unnatural. Something wrong. The front door creaked open. Ella took a step back, shaking her head. No, she whispered. No, no, no. The whispering grew louder, curling around her like smoke. Come inside, Ella. The shadows on the porch shifted. A figure stepped forward. Tall, thin, waiting. Ella turned and ran. But the street stretched longer and longer, the houses blurring together. No matter how fast she moved, she wasn't getting anywhere. Her lungs burned, her vision swam, and then she wasn't running anymore. She was standing on the porch of the Miller house. The door stood open before her, waiting. The whispers turned into laughter. The figure in the doorway lifted a hand, pale, bony fingers curling in invitation. Welcome home. The door slammed shut behind her, and the street outside faded into nothing. Ella's scream echoed through the darkness as the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, her hands clawing at the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Her breath came in frantic gasps. The air inside the house was heavy, thick with dust and something else, something rotting. The whispers returned. "You're home now." Ella turned, pressing her back against the door. The room before her was nothing like the abandoned house she had seen from the outside. The walls were pristine, the furniture polished, the chandelier above casting a dim, golden glow. It looked lived in, but it wasn't right. The house felt aware. Ella forced herself to move forward. "Hello," she called, her voice small. No answer. A long hallway stretched ahead, lined with doors. At the far end, a staircase wound upward into shadows. Ella's pulse pounded in her ears. She had to find a way out. She reached for the nearest door and turned the handle. Locked. She tried the next. Locked. One by one, she tested each door, but they refused to open. The whispers followed her, growing louder with each failed attempt. "You belong here. You never left." A cold shiver crawled down her spine. Then, from somewhere upstairs, a creak. Ella froze. Another creak. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Coming down the stairs. Ella's chest tightened. She backed away, her mind screaming for her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The footsteps grew louder. A shadow stretched across the floor at the top of the staircase. Something was waiting. Then a voice. Soft. Familiar. "Ella?" Her breath hitched. It was her mother's voice. But that was impossible. Her mother had been dead for 15 years. A single sob escaped her lips. "No," she whispered. The shadow at the top of the stairs shifted. Then a figure began to descend. Not her mother. Not human. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. But the voice remained the same. "Come here, sweetheart." Ella's body finally reacted. She ran. She sprinted down the hall, her heart hammering, her hands blindly reaching for anything, any way out. Then a door opened on its own. Ella didn't hesitate. She dove inside and slammed it shut behind her. Darkness swallowed her. She pressed her back against the wood, her breath ragged. Silence. Then a whisper right next to her ear. That door wasn't there before. A hand clamped over her mouth, and the lights went out. Ella thrashed against the hand over her mouth, her scream muffled. She clawed at unseen fingers, her heart slamming against her ribs. Then the grip vanished. She stumbled forward, gasping for breath. The room around her was still pitch black. Ella fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking. She pressed the power button. Nothing. Dead. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with something damp and rotten. She reached out, feeling along the walls. Smooth. Cold. Not wood. Not plaster. Stone. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't the hallway she had entered. The Miller house was old, but it wasn't made of stone. A faint sound echoed in the darkness, a slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. Water? Or something else? Ella swallowed hard. "Hello," she whispered. No answer. She pressed forward, one hand on the wall to guide her. The floor beneath her was uneven, rough like damp earth. Then her fingers brushed something. Soft, warm, breathing. Ella recoiled with a choked gasp. A voice whispered from the dark. "Why did you come back?" Ella's blood turned to ice. Who's there? Silence. Then a sudden, wet breath against her ear. "You were never supposed to leave." Ella stumbled backward, her foot catching on something, bones? Roots? She didn't know. She hit the ground hard, her palms scraping against the rough surface. The whispering surged around her, overlapping voices, some pleading, some laughing, some sobbing. "We see you. We hear you. We remember." Ella squeezed her eyes shut. This isn't real. This isn't real. Then a light. Dim, flickering. She opened her eyes. A single candle burned a few feet away, its weak glow barely illuminating the space. She was in a cellar. Stone walls stretched high above her, slick with moisture. Wooden beams sagged from the ceiling. The air smelled of mildew and decay. But what made her breath catch? What sent pure terror screaming through her veins were the faces. Dozens of them, pale, hollow-eyed, staring at her from the walls. Not painted, not carved, embedded. Their mouths hung open in silent screams, their eyes wide with eternal horror. And then one of them blinked. Ella ran. She bolted toward the candle, toward the only visible doorway at the far end of the cellar. The whispers howled behind her, the faces twisting, shifting, moving. Something grabbed her ankle. She hit the ground with a cry, her nails scraping against the damp stone as she tried to pull herself free. A hand, thin, bony, inhuman, emerged from the floor, its fingers tightening around her leg. Ella kicked, screaming. The hand held on. The candle flickered, and the door slammed shut. Darkness swallowed her again, and the whispering laughed. Ella thrashed against the skeletal grip tightening around her ankle. Her fingers clawed at the floor, desperate for something to hold on to. The whispering rose to a fever pitch. Stay with us. We've been waiting. You were always meant to be here. The hand yanked harder. Ella let out a strangled cry as she was dragged across the damp stone floor. Her nails scraped against the rough surface, leaving bloody streaks. Then, her foot connected with something solid. A sickening crack. The grip loosened. Ella didn't waste a second. She scrambled to her feet and lunged toward the door. She slammed into it, her hands fumbling for a handle. Anything. Nothing. The door was gone. Her breath hitched. She turned, pressing her back against the cold stone. The candle had almost burned out, its flames sputtering. Shadows stretched along the walls, moving. The faces embedded in the stone were shifting, their mouths twisted into new shapes, their eyes rolling wildly. And then one of them spoke. You should have left when you had the chance. Ella's stomach lurched. The voice was hers. She took a step back, her entire body trembling. No, she whispered. This isn't real. The face in the wall smiled. It will be. The candle died, and the darkness came alive. A cold wind surged through the cellar, carrying with it a sound like bones rattling. Ella squeezed her eyes shut. Wake up! Wake up! But she wasn't dreaming. Something moved in the dark. A slow, deliberate shuffle. Closer. Ella held her breath. Then, a whisper right against her ear. Run! Ella didn't hesitate. She turned and bolted blindly into the darkness. The walls shifted around her. The space twisted, stretching into impossible angles. The cellar was changing. Footsteps pounded behind her. Too many. Too close. Ella's pulse thundered in her ears as she reached out, searching, praying for a way out. Then her fingers brushed something. Wood. A door. She shoved against it, throwing her full weight forward. It burst open, and she fell through. She hit the ground hard, her body colliding with something cold and smooth. Carpet. Ella gasped, pushing herself up. She was back in the Miller house. The grand hallway stretched before her, the chandelier above casting a dim, flickering glow. But something was wrong. The house was different. The furniture was new, the wallpaper pristine. A fire crackled in the distant hearth. It looked lived in, as if it had never been abandoned. Ella's breath caught. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Not behind her. Not above her. But from the next room. Soft. Steady. Coming closer. A shadow flickered in the doorway. Ella's body went rigid. Then a voice. You finally made it home. Ella's breath hitched as the shadow in the doorway grew clearer. A woman stepped forward, her bare feet soundless against the polished wood floor. She was familiar. Too familiar. Ella's knees nearly buckled. The woman was her. Same dark hair. Same wary eyes. Same terrified expression frozen on her face. But there was something wrong. The other Ella's skin was too pale, her eyes too hollow. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words Ella couldn't hear. Then, the whispering returned. You've been here before. You never left. The other Ella twitched. Her head jerked at an unnatural angle, her mouth stretching into a grin far too wide. Welcome back, Ella ran. She turned and bolted down the hallway, her mind screaming for an exit. The walls around her shifted, warping as if the house itself were breathing. Doors appeared and vanished. The floor beneath her rippled. She didn't stop. Somewhere behind her, footsteps. Not just one set, many. A chorus of echoing steps chased her through the twisting corridors. Then a door. Not disappearing. Not changing. A real door. Ella lunged for it, yanking it open. She stumbled inside and froze. She was standing in a bedroom. A child's bedroom. The air smelled of dust and something sickly sweet. Faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, and an old rocking chair sat in the corner, motionless. A single bed rested against the far wall, and in it a body. Ella's stomach lurched. The child, no older than 6, lay motionless beneath a thin, moth-eaten blanket. Her skin was gray, her eyes open, and her lips moved, barely a whisper. "Help me." Ella took a step back. No, this isn't real." The girl's head snapped toward her, her mouth stretching into a grotesque smile. "But you already did." The door behind Ella slammed shut. The rocking chair moved, and something breathed in the darkness. Ella's body went rigid. The girl in the bed didn't blink. Her too-wide smile remained frozen in place, her lips barely moving as she whispered again. "You already helped me." Ella's pulse pounded. I don't know you," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl giggled, a sound that didn't belong in a place like this. The rocking chair in the corner creaked, slowly, rhythmically. Ella turned toward it, her breath catching in her throat. The chair was moving, rocking on its own. No one sat in it, but the impression of a body was there. A deep, sagging indentation in the worn fabric. Ella stepped back, her hand fumbling for the door handle behind her. Locked, of course. The little girl sat up. The sheets fell away, revealing her thin frame. Her nightgown was yellowed with age, her skin stretched tight over her small bones. Her eyes, black and endless. "You promised." Ella's breath came in short, sharp gasps. "I don't." "You promised you'd take me with you." The walls shuddered. The air grew thick, pressing against Ella's skin like unseen hands. Memories not her own crashed into her mind. A woman's voice, soft, urgent. "We have to go. Now." A child's hand in hers. Small, trusting, running through the dark. The Miller house groaning around them. A door slamming, and then screaming. Ella gasped, stumbling back. The room spun. "You left me here." The girl's voice was sharp now, accusing. The rocking chair slammed to a stop. Ella turned toward it, and something stood there. A figure, tall, thin. Its face was wrong, stretched, twisted, its mouth too wide. It knew her. It had been waiting. The child in the bed laughed, and the figure moved, straight for Ella. Ella screamed. She yanked at the door, pounding against the wood. No way out. The thing in the corner lurched forward. Its limbs were jerky, unnatural, its mouth split open. Not in a scream, in a smile. Ella grabbed the first thing she could, a rusted lamp from the bedside table, and swung. The impact sent the thing reeling. She didn't wait. She ran, straight for the window. The glass shattered as she threw herself through it. Cold air hit her like a shock, and then darkness. Ella hit the ground with a painful thud. Dirt, leaves. The scent of damp earth filled her nose. She groaned, rolling onto her side. The Miller house loomed above her. But something was different. The windows were gone, the front door missing, like the house had never been meant to be entered. Ella struggled to her feet, her body aching. She turned, expecting to see the familiar streets of Brookhaven. But there was nothing. No houses, no streetlights, just an endless stretch of forest. And behind her, the Miller house breathed. And then the front door opened. A dark figure stood in the doorway, watching, waiting, and then it stepped forward. Ella ran. She didn't look back. She couldn't, because deep down, she knew the house wasn't done with her yet. Ella sprinted through the endless forest, her breath ragged, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The trees loomed high, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. There was no street, no houses, no sign that Brookhaven had ever existed. Only this, a nightmarish, unending expanse of darkened woods. Behind her, the Miller house stood watching, and something had stepped outside, something following her. Ella didn't dare look back. She pushed forward, weaving through the trees, her body screaming in protest. Her feet tore through the damp earth, kicking up fallen leaves as she ran. Then a voice, not whispered, not distant, but right beside her ear. "Where are you going?" Ella's stomach lurched. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root. She fell. The ground hit her hard, knocking the air from her lungs. A shiver crawled up her spine as the voice laughed. Low, mocking. Ella scrambled to her feet, spinning around, nothing. The woods were silent, dead. Only her own frantic breath filled the cold air. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to move. Keep running? She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stop. But then something changed. The trees shifted, just like the Miller house. A sickening distortion, like the world had shuddered and reassembled itself wrong. Ella stopped. Her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. She turned, and her blood ran cold. She was back in front of the Miller house. She hadn't been running away. She'd been running in circles. And the house was closer. The front door was open wide now, a gaping black mouth inviting her in. Ella staggered backward, shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "No, this isn't real. You never left." The whisper came from inside her own head. Ella clenched her fists, squeezing her eyes shut. This was a trick, a hallucination. She had to wake up. But then something touched her. A hand, ice-cold fingers wrapping around her wrist. Ella's eyes flew open. A face was inches from hers. Hollow, twisted, familiar. It was her own, but not her. The other Ella, the one from the Miller house. The copy, the thing. It smiled. It's time to come home. And then it pulled. Ella screamed. And the world went black. Ella's scream died in her throat as she was yanked into the darkness. The world around her collapsed. The trees, the sky, even the damp earth beneath her feet, all of it vanished in an instant, swallowed whole by the black void. And then light, blinding, artificial, too bright. Ella gasped, her lungs burning as she stumbled forward. Her hands hit hardwood floors. A house. No, her house. She was back in Brookhaven, back in her living room. The walls were clean, her furniture neatly arranged just as she had left it. Sunlight streamed through the bay window, casting warm, golden light across the polished floors. Everything looked normal, but the moment she breathed in, she knew something was wrong. The air was too thick, the silence too deep, and then she noticed it. Her front door. It was gone. Not just closed, not just locked, gone, as if it had never been there at all. Ella's heart pounded in her chest. She spun around, windows, back doors, everything that should lead out was just wall. She was trapped. You never left. The whisper slithered through the air, curling around her like a living thing. Ella turned and nearly collapsed. There, standing in the hallway, was her. Not the twisted, hollow version from before, but an exact replica. Same posture, same wide, terrified eyes. The copy opened its mouth, speaking in her voice. "We have to get out." Ella staggered back. "Who? What are you?" The copy shook its head. "Don't you remember? You already escaped. You left me here." Ella's stomach dropped. Memories, half-formed, hazy, rushed in. The first time she stepped into Brookhaven. The first time she saw the Miller house. That sickening feeling of déjà vu. Had she been here before? Had she left something behind? The copy took a step forward. Its breath hitched, like it was about to cry. "Please, Ella, we can't stay here. It won't let us go." Ella's pulse thundered in her ears. Before she could respond, the walls shook. The house groaned. And then the ceiling cracked open. A black, writhing void poured down. Something was coming. And this time, it wasn't going to let her run. The ceiling split open, and the darkness spilled out. Not like shadows, like something alive. It moved like thick, black tendrils slithering down the walls, stretching across the floor. The air turned frigid, the temperature dropping so fast Ella could see her breath. Her double, the other Ella, staggered back, shaking her head. No, no, not again. Ella froze. Again. But before she could ask, the walls shifted. The living room twisted inside out, stretching impossibly far. The coffee table warped. The furniture melted. The bay window vanished. Ella turned. Her front door was back. Only now it wasn't a door. It was a gaping black entrance, identical to the one inside the Miller house. A void that seemed to breathe. Ella's skin crawled. She knew if she stepped through, she wouldn't be walking into Brookhaven. She'd be walking into it. The house itself. Something moved in the dark. A figure. Tall. Thin. Wrong. The thing that had been watching her since she moved in. It stepped closer. And as it did, the other Ella screamed. We have to go. Now! Ella turned, and the walls collapsed. She was falling, plunging into the black abyss. And before she hit the bottom, everything stopped. She was standing in the Miller house. The real one. The air was thick with dust and decay. The scent of something long rotting. The floors groaned beneath her feet. The front door was gone. The only way was forward. Ella swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. The other Ella was gone. She was alone. And then a whisper. Not one voice. Dozens. Hundreds. She's back. He remembers. She never really left. Ella's hands clenched into fists. No more running. She took a slow step forward. Whatever was waiting for her in the Miller house, it had answers. And she was going to find them, even if it meant she never left again. Ella took a step forward. Then another. The house breathed around her. The air was thick, almost liquid, pressing against her skin, making it hard to move. She wasn't just inside a house. She was inside something alive. The whispers never stopped. She's back. She forgot. She shouldn't have come. Her fingers itched to cover her ears, but she knew it wouldn't help. The voices weren't coming from outside her. They were inside her head. She moved carefully through the dust-covered hallway. The floorboards creaked under her weight, but the sound didn't echo. It was swallowed by the silence. The Miller house had always looked abandoned. But now, Ella saw the truth. It wasn't abandoned. It had been waiting for her. She reached the staircase. The wood was warped, curving unnaturally, as if the steps had been stretched by something trying to claw its way out. Ella's pulse quickened. She knew she had to go up. She didn't know how she knew. She just did. The first step groaned beneath her foot. The second shifted. By the time she reached the third, the walls began to move. Not just the wallpaper peeling, not just the wood creaking. The house itself was shifting. The hallway behind her was longer. The front door was gone. She kept moving. Step, step, step. A door waited at the top of the stairs. And she knew. She had seen it before. Ella's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold. Something waited on the other side. Something that knew her. She turned the knob. The door swung open. And there, inside the room, was her bedroom. Not just any bedroom. Her bedroom. From before she moved to Brookhaven. From before she even knew this town existed. The same bedspread. The same bookshelf. The same framed photograph of her and her mother on the nightstand. Ella's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't possible. She took a slow step inside. Everything was exactly the same, except for the mirror. It stood in the corner, tall and cracked. And in the reflection, someone was watching her. Not just anyone. Herself. Not the twisted double. Not the other Ella. But her. And then the reflection spoke. You never left. Ella's breath came in short, sharp gasps. You never left. The words clung to the air, thick and heavy, sinking into her bones. She took a step closer to the mirror. So did her reflection. Every movement was identical, except for the eyes. The Ella in the mirror didn't blink, didn't breathe. And as Ella stepped closer, she noticed something else. The room in the reflection wasn't the same. It was rotting. The bed was covered in mold. The walls were streaked with something dark. The floorboards were splintered, curling at the edges as if something had burned them. And the photograph, the one of her and her mother, it was missing. Instead, there was a different photo on the nightstand, one that didn't exist in her world. Ella leaned in. Her stomach dropped. It was a picture of her, standing in front of the Miller house. But she wasn't alone. A tall, shadowy figure loomed behind her, its face a hollow void. And scrawled across the bottom of the photo, "You were never supposed to leave." Ella staggered back. The reflection didn't move. It just stared at her, the edges of its mouth twitching into something almost like a smile. "This is where you belong." Ella's pulse pounded. "No," she whispered. "This isn't real. I left. I moved here. The reflection laughed. The sound was hollow, distant, like an echo of something long forgotten. "You moved here." The mirror shook. The room flickered, and then everything collapsed. Ella hit the floor hard. Her vision blurred. The mirror was gone. The room was gone. She was back in the Miller house. But now, there was no door. No way out. The wallpaper peeled away, curling back like burned paper, revealing the true walls beneath. Rotten, wet, covered in scratches, and etched deep into the wood, over and over again, her name, ELLA, dozens of times, hundreds, some fresh, some faded, as if she had been here before, as if she had been trying to get out. "You've always been here." The whisper was everywhere. The walls shuddered, and then the ceiling cracked open. The black void poured down. Something reached for her, and this time, she had nowhere left to run. Ella stumbled back. The black void poured from the ceiling like living ink, stretching toward her in writhing tendrils. The walls groaned, shifting as if something was pushing through from the other side. Her name was everywhere. ELLA, scratched, carved, begging. She tried to move, but the air had thickened. It pressed against her like an unseen force, keeping her trapped. "You've always been here." The voice wasn't coming from the house anymore. It was coming from inside her. Ella gritted her teeth. No, this wasn't real. She forced herself to focus, to fight the pull of whatever was trying to consume her. Then she saw the other names. Beneath hers, buried under layers of scratches, she saw faint outlines of names almost erased. SAMANTHA, DANIEL, CLAIRE. Ella's blood turned to ice. Claire, her neighbor, the one who had welcomed her to Brookhaven, the one who had told her there was no Miller house. Ella's stomach twisted. Had Claire been here before? Had she forgotten? Or worse, had Claire escaped? Her breath hitched. If Claire had once been here, then maybe there was a way out. She just had to find it. Ella turned, searching for anything, a gap in the wall, a weakness in the floor, something that didn't belong. The house was shifting again. The shadows crawled, stretching along the walls like fingers reaching for her. Then a doorway. It wasn't there before. A thin, wooden door at the far end of the room. It looked wrong, like it had been painted into reality, almost too flat to be real. But it was there, and she had no other choice. Ella lunged for it. The shadows screamed. A hand grabbed her ankle. Ice cold, clawed fingers. Ella kicked. She yanked the door open and fell through. She hit the ground with a jarring force. The air shifted. She gasped. The smell of autumn leaves. The sound of birds. Ella pushed herself up. She was outside. She was on Sycamore Lane. Her house was across the street. Brookhaven was perfect again. But something was wrong. The Miller house was gone, as if it had never existed. And standing on her porch, watching her, was Claire, smiling. "Welcome to Brookhaven." Ella's skin crawled. Claire's smile was warm, familiar wrong. She stood on the porch like nothing had happened, like she hadn't been in that house, like she hadn't vanished from the walls. Ella's heart pounded. She was back on Sycamore Lane. But was it real? The town looked the same. The perfectly trimmed lawns, the golden glow of streetlights, the smell of burning firewood in the distance. But something felt off. The silence. There were no voices, no children laughing, no passing cars. And yet, she could feel eyes on her, watching, waiting. Claire stepped off the porch, approaching her. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said lightly. Ella's hands clenched into fists. Claire, she said slowly, have you ever seen the Miller house? Claire blinked. The what? The house at the end of the street, Ella pressed. The one that's gone. Claire's expression didn't change, but her eyes did. For a split second, something flickered across her face, something too fast to catch. Then she laughed. Oh, Ella, she said, you must be exhausted. Maybe you should rest. Ella's stomach turned. No. This wasn't right. She had seen Claire's name in that house. Claire had been there, so why was she acting like nothing had happened? Ella took a step back. I think I should go inside, she said carefully. Claire nodded, smiling. Of course. Get some sleep. Ella turned, walking toward her house. She reached for the doorknob and froze. The door was already open, just a crack, as if someone was waiting for her. And inside, the air wasn't right. It smelled like dust, like something old, like the Miller house. Ella's breath hitched. She turned to look back at Claire, but she was gone. Ella stepped inside. The air shifted the moment she crossed the threshold. It was Brookhaven. It was her house. But it wasn't. Her furniture was there. Her boxes. But the walls, they weren't right. The paint was peeling. The wood was rotting. And there, on the floor, a trail of footprints, wet, leading deeper into the house. Ella's fingers trembled as she reached into her pocket, gripping her phone. No signal. Her breathing quickened. She followed the footprints, step by step, into the hallway. The light flickered overhead. A shadow moved at the end of the corridor. Ella's pulse spiked. She wasn't alone. Something was here. Then a voice. Soft. Familiar. Iya. She froze. Because the voice, it was her own. Ella's pulse thundered in her ears. The voice had come from down the hall. Her own voice. Iya. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't a trick of the wind. It was someone else. Someone who sounded just like her. Her breath shook as she took a step forward. The hallway stretched longer. The footprints darkened. And at the end of the corridor, a door. It shouldn't be there. It wasn't there before. But now it stood waiting. A thin crack of blackness seeped from underneath it, as if the space beyond didn't hold light. Ella reached for the handle. Her fingers burned the moment she touched it. A flash of memories struck her, but they weren't hers. A girl, trapped in the Miller house, scratching at the walls, begging. The girl turned. It was Ella. Her chest tightened. No, this wasn't possible. She shoved the door open and fell inside. The moment Ella hit the ground, she knew. This wasn't her house. It wasn't Brookhaven. It was the other place, the space in between. The floor groaned beneath her weight, warped and wet. The walls twisted, shifting, breathing. And across the room, someone stood in the dark. Not just a shadow, not just a figure, but her, the other Ella. She was barefoot, dressed in the same clothes Ella had worn when she moved here. But her skin, it was wrong, faded, thin, like she had been here for years. And when she lifted her head, her eyes were hollow. Empty. You shouldn't have left. Ella's breath hitched. You forgot, didn't you? The other Ella whispered. The walls shivered. The room closed in. You left, but you weren't supposed to. You were part of this place. Ella shook her head. No, that's not true. I moved here. I just got here. The other Ella took a step forward. Ella took a step back. But the door was gone. Only blackness remained. You're supposed to stay. Her voice was softer now, like she was tired, like she had been saying this for a very, very long time. You forgot, but the town remembers. Ella's heart slammed against her ribs. The town remembers. The names on the walls. The way Claire had hesitated. The Miller house disappearing. Ella hadn't just moved here. She had been here before. She had left. And now she was back. The realization hit her like ice. No! Her voice came out in a whisper. That's not true. That's... The other Ella's expression darkened. It is. The room collapsed, and the darkness swallowed them whole. Ella's scream vanished into the blackness. The floor was gone. The walls dissolved. She was falling. Cold air whipped past her, dragging her deeper into the void. Her arms flailed, reaching for something, anything, to hold on to, but there was nothing. Then she hit the ground. Not hard, not painfully, like she had been placed. Her breath shuddered. She was in a room, the Miller house, except it wasn't ruined. It was whole. The wallpaper was intact, though faded and yellowed. The floorboards didn't creak beneath her weight. A fireplace burned softly in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the space. This wasn't a house that had been abandoned. It was a house that had been lived in. Recently. Her stomach twisted. Something was here. A whisper brushed against her ear. You came back. Ella spun. A woman stood in the doorway. She was tall, thin, wrapped in a long black dress that hung from her frame like old curtains. Her skin was gray. Her eyes were too dark. But the worst part? Her mouth. It was stitched shut. Ella's body locked up. No, the woman took a slow step forward. Her shadow stretched across the floor, curling like smoke. You don't remember me, the voice whispered again. But the woman's lips didn't move. The whisper was inside Ella's head. A deep, clawing fear took root in her chest. She did remember, not the woman's face, not her name, but the feeling, a memory, a cold hand on her wrist, a voice in the dark. Stay. Ella's breath hitched. This woman had been here before. With her, the house groaned. The lights flickered, then died. Darkness swallowed everything, and Ella ran. Her feet pounded against the wooden floor. The hallways twisted, stretching in directions they shouldn't. Doors appeared. She yanked one open, only to find another hallway, another door, and another. She wasn't getting out. The house was keeping her inside. Stay. The whisper chilled her bones. She whipped around, pressing herself against the wall, her heart slamming. The woman was still there, standing at the end of the corridor, silent, watching. Ella reached into her pocket, fingers brushing against the only thing she had left. Her car keys. Something sharp clicked in her brain. The first day she arrived. Her car. She had parked in the driveway. She had walked through the front door. But had she ever left? The thought terrified her. Had she been here longer than she remembered? Had she already forgotten? She gritted her teeth. No, I am not staying here. She turned and ran, straight toward the front door. She could see it now, wide open. The cold night beyond. The air was different out there. Real. She sprinted. 10 feet. 5. Her fingers stretched out, and something grabbed her ankle. Ella fell. The ground swallowed her, and the house took her back. Darkness. A heavy, suffocating weight. Ella gasped, thrashing against it. But she wasn't in the house anymore. She was below it. The basement. Cold stone pressed against her back. Dust filled her lungs. She sat up, heart hammering, and her breath caught. The room was filled with people. Or rather, shadows of people. They stood against the walls, their bodies blurred, faded, as if they weren't fully there. And yet, their eyes were. Wide, staring, fixed on her. A dozen. No more. And among them, Claire. Ella's blood ran cold. Claire, she whispered. Her neighbor didn't move, didn't blink, but the others did. Slowly, the shadows stepped forward, and one by one, they spoke. You left us. You forgot. You were supposed to stay. The whispers pressed against her skull. Ella shook her head. No, I don't belong here, she stammered. I just moved here. But the shadows loomed closer, and deep in the darkness, the woman stood watching, silent, waiting. You were home. Ella's heart pounded. The shadows closed in, their voices whispering in her head, too many at once. You left us. You forgot. Stay. The weight of their words pressed against her skull, cold and thick like smoke. Her hands shook. She wasn't supposed to be here. She had only just moved in, hadn't she? The longer she stared at their faces, the more a sickening dread coiled in her chest. She recognized them. Claire, David, Sophia, Max, her neighbors. But their bodies were fading, their outlines flickering like candlelight, as if they weren't fully real. Or as if they never had been. Ella staggered back. No, this isn't possible. Her pulse hammered as her mind reeled, digging through fragments of memory that didn't quite fit. Hadn't she seen Claire just yesterday? Hadn't she spoken to her? But then she remembered the hesitation. The way Claire looked at the Miller house as if it didn't exist. Hadn't Claire told her there was no house there? Then how could she be here? The shadows pressed in. Ella's breath came fast and shallow. Her hands trembled as she took a step back. "I don't belong here," she whispered. "I'm not supposed to be here." "You are home," the voices whispered back. A cold gust rushed through the basement. And suddenly, Ella remembered. Not the move, not the fresh start, but the first time, the real first time she had lived here. Brookhaven, the Miller house. She had been here before. She had escaped. But the town had never let her go. The realization hit her like ice. Brookhaven didn't just take people. It kept them trapped, rewritten, forced to live the same life over and over until they forgot, until they became the town itself. Ella clutched her head. No, no. The shadows stretched forward. Their hands grasped for her. And in the darkness, the stitched-mouthed woman took a step closer. It's time to remember. The room shuddered. Ella's mind fractured. The memories poured in, memories she had lost. She had been younger, newly moved in, excited, hopeful. Brookhaven had seemed like home, until people started disappearing, until she started forgetting. The first time she had seen the Miller house, she had done the same thing, asked about it. And just like now, the town had tried to erase her, rewrite her, make her one of them. But she had escaped. Somehow, she had left this place, fled into the night, and then she had forgotten. The town had let her go, for a while, until she came back, until it brought her back. Ella's stomach twisted. Brookhaven had never been her choice. It had called her home, and now it wasn't going to let her go again. "You belong here," the shadows whispered. "You are home." Her vision blurred. Her body felt heavy, like she was sinking. For a split second, she could feel herself slipping, forgetting everything. And then a voice, soft, distant. Her own voice. "Run." Ella's breath hitched. She turned, sprinting toward the stairs. The shadows screamed. The woman lunged. But Ella reached the top, slamming through the basement door, and ran. The house shifted, the walls twisting violently, trying to hold her in. But she remembered now. She knew what the town was. And if she left now, for real this time, Brookhaven could never call her back again. The front door stood open. The air outside was different. Real. She leapt forward, and for the first time, she left Brookhaven behind. The morning was cold. Ella sat in a coffee shop, hands wrapped around a steaming cup she had made it. She didn't know how. Didn't know if she had truly escaped, or if Brookhaven had simply let her go. But she knew one thing. She was never going back. A newspaper lay on the table in front of her. Her fingers trembled as she turned the page. And there, in the missing person section, was her own name. Ella Marsh, missing from Brookhaven. A chill ran down her spine. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep reading. And below her name was another, Claire Rodriguez, missing from Brookhaven. Ella's breath caught. She hadn't saved Claire. She had left her behind. The guilt settled deep in her chest. And then, just as she was about to look away, the ink shifted, blurred, and Claire's name disappeared. Ella's stomach dropped. The newspaper was erasing her. No, not just erasing her, replacing her. A new name appeared beneath her own. A new resident, a new victim. Brookhaven had taken someone else. Ella's hands shook. She wasn't the last. Brookhaven would keep calling, keep pulling people in, and one day it might call her back. She closed the newspaper and left without looking back. Ella didn't sleep that night. Even after leaving the coffee shop, after throwing the newspaper into the nearest trash can, after driving as far away as possible, she couldn't shake the feeling that Brookhaven was still watching her, waiting. By morning, she checked into a motel nearly 100 miles away. She locked the door, checked it twice, 3 times, but sleep never came. Her dreams were filled with whispers, with faces, with Claire's voice. "You left me." Ella woke with a start, heart hammering, throat dry. She forced herself to sit up, rubbing at her face. "It's over. I got out. But her gut twisted with doubt. Her phone lay face down on the nightstand, buzzing with an alert. One new message. Her breath caught. She hadn't given her number to anyone in Brookhaven. She hadn't given it to Claire. Slowly, she picked up the phone, pulse pounding in her ears. The message was from an unknown number. Come back. Ella's fingers went numb. And then below the text, an image loaded. A picture of her old house. Except the windows weren't dark anymore. The lights were on. And standing on the porch, staring directly at the camera, was Claire. Her mouth stitched shut. Ella's grip tightened around the phone. She had escaped Brookhaven. But Brookhaven wasn't done with her. Not yet. Ella dropped the phone. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts, her pulse hammering against her ribs. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the phone again, staring at the message. The text was still there. Come back. And Claire stood on the porch, her eyes wide and hollow, her lips stitched shut. A deep, gnawing dread twisted in Ella's stomach. She knew what Brookhaven did to people. It rewrote them, erased them, turned them into something else. And Claire had been erased. But somehow, she was still there, still waiting. The motel room felt smaller, the air heavier. Ella locked her phone, then unlocked it again, hoping, somehow, that the message would be gone. It wasn't. Instead, there was a new one. If you don't come back, someone else will. Ella's stomach dropped. The town wasn't just calling her back, it was threatening her. She wanted to ignore it, wanted to run again, but she knew the truth. Brookhaven didn't let go. It just waited, and if she didn't go back, it would take someone else. Ella spent the next hour pacing the motel room, mind racing. I can't go back. I barely got out. But Claire, and the text, and the threat. Would Brookhaven actually take someone new just to bring her back? Yes. She already knew the answer. She tried calling the number. It rang once, twice, then static, then a whisper. Aya. Her breath hitched. She hung up immediately. No, she wouldn't let it pull her in that easily. Maybe she could warn someone. Maybe she could tell the police, get them to check Brookhaven, investigate the missing people. She grabbed her laptop and searched. Brookhaven, Oregon missing persons. The results loaded, and Ella's blood ran cold. Claire's name was gone. Not listed. Not anywhere. Just like before. Like she had never existed. Ella clenched her jaw. Brookhaven was already erasing her. Already moving on, her hands hovered over the keyboard. What do I do? She tried searching her own name again. Ella Marsh, missing from Brookhaven, still there. Still listed. The town hadn't erased her. Not yet. She scrolled further, scanning the page, looking for anything that might help. Then she saw it. A new name. Jordan Calloway. Missing from Brookhaven, Ella's breath caught. Someone new. The town had already chosen. And it wasn't her. Ella sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The motel parking lot was quiet. The early morning light was gray and cold. She didn't want to do this. Didn't want to go back. But Claire and Jordan. Brookhaven was still taking people. And she was the only one who remembered. She pulled up the message on her phone one last time. The image of Claire, standing on her old porch, stitched mouth frozen in a silent scream. Ella exhaled. Then she put the car in drive and turned back toward Brookhaven. The highway stretched endlessly before Ella, the early morning mist clinging to the trees like ghostly fingers. As she neared the turnoff to Brookhaven, an icy dread coiled in her gut. The town had let her go once, but would it let her leave again? She checked her phone. No new messages. No missed calls. Just the last text. If you don't come back, someone else will. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Claire. The stitches. The hollow, knowing stare. And now, Jordan Calloway was missing. Ella clenched the steering wheel tighter. If Brookhaven had already erased Jordan, it meant time was running out. She passed the welcome to Brookhaven sign. For a split second, her breath hitched. The town looked different, like it had changed in the time she had been gone. Or worse, like it had been waiting for her. She rolled past the familiar streets, the houses still standing, still perfect. But something was missing. No children playing. No joggers. No friendly waves from neighbors watering their lawns. It was silent, like the town was holding its breath. Ella pulled up to her old house and parked. The porch light was on. Her chest tightened. She hadn't lived here in weeks. There was no reason for that light to be on. She stepped out of the car. The air was too still, like Brookhaven had been waiting for her to step back onto its streets. She climbed the porch steps slowly, heart hammering, and then the front door creaked open. Ella froze. The door yawned open before her, revealing a sliver of darkness inside. She hadn't touched it, hadn't even reached for the handle. Her gut screamed at her to run, but she didn't, because standing just inside the doorway was Claire, her lips still stitched shut, her head tilted slightly, those same hollow eyes fixed on Ella. A tremor crawled up Ella's spine. Claire? No response. Claire just stood there, as if waiting. The house behind her was wrong. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows stretching too far. The hallway behind Claire was longer than it should have been, like the house had swallowed something much bigger than before. Ella took a shaky step forward. Claire, if you can hear me, I'm going to help you, okay? Claire blinked. Then she raised a hand and pointed past Ella. Ella's breath hitched. Slowly, she turned her head and saw a figure standing in the street. Tall, motionless. Jordan Calloway. Or at least, what used to be him. His mouth wasn't stitched shut. It was wide open, a gaping black void. And then he moved. Jordan shouldn't have been there. The last record of him had been a missing persons report. He had disappeared days ago. But now he stood in the street, arms hanging limp, his head tilted slightly to one side. And his mouth, that awful, endless void where his mouth should have been. It wasn't just a shadow. It was moving. Ella's pulse pounded in her ears. The air around Jordan seemed wrong. Like he wasn't standing on the street at all. Like he was a layer of something else superimposed onto reality. And then he took a step toward her. Ella's breath caught. No, this wasn't Jordan. Brookhaven had taken him, and whatever it had made him into, it was coming for her. Claire suddenly moved. Her stitched mouth twisted, contorting. She shook her head violently, mouthing something behind the stitches. Ella didn't need to hear the words to understand. Run. Jordan, or the thing wearing his face, took another step forward. And this time, the shadows moved with him. Ella's instinct screamed. She didn't wait. She didn't hesitate. She ran. Claire's warning was enough. Whatever had become of Jordan wasn't human anymore, and it was coming for her. Her feet pounded against the pavement as she sprinted toward her car. The keys were in her pocket, but her hands were slick with sweat, shaking as she yanked them out. Behind her, the sound of shuffling footsteps dragged against the asphalt. Faster. Ella fumbled with the key fob, pressing the unlock button over and over, desperate for the beep. Click. She yanked the door open and threw herself inside, slamming the lock down as hard as she could. For a second, she thought she was safe. Then, thud. A hand slammed against the driver's side window. Ella screamed. Jordan, or what was left of him, was right there, his gaping mouth still twisting, warping, consuming itself. And then he spoke, but the sound was wrong. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't words. It was static, like a radio tuned to an empty frequency, a garbled, distorted screech crawling into her ears. Ella clapped her hands over them, her body shaking, her mind splitting apart from the noise. Then the car shook. The door handle rattled. He was trying to get in. Ella gasped for air, blindly slamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. She didn't think. She didn't even look. She hit the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement as she tore away from the house, the car fishtailing wildly. In the rearview mirror, Jordan stood in the street, watching her go, unmoving. And behind him, Claire, still standing in the open doorway, still waiting. Ella didn't stop driving until she was out of town, or at least she thought she was. The road stretched endlessly before her, swallowed by darkness, her headlights barely piercing the thick fog rolling in. The highway should have taken her back to the city, but instead, the road signs were wrong. They all pointed back to Brookhaven. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. "No," she whispered. "No, I left. I got out." But the signs didn't change. And no matter how long she drove, the road didn't end. She tried pulling up her GPS. No service. The clock on the dashboard blinked, 3:17 a.m. The same time it had been when she left. Her stomach twisted. Brookhaven wasn't letting her go. Then her radio crackled. Ella's breath hitched as the speakers hissed. Whined, then a voice. A whisper. "Come back." Ella slammed the power button, but the radio didn't turn off. "Come back," before it's too late. Her hands were shaking. She pressed the brakes, and the car lurched. Not because she had stopped, because something was in the road. Ella's blood ran cold. There, standing right in front of her headlights, was Claire. Mouth still stitched shut. Eyes pleading. Ella's heart pounded. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't a hallucination. Claire was trying to help her. Ella's grip on the steering wheel tightened. She had a choice. Keep running or turn back. Before the town took someone else. Before it took her. She swallowed hard and put the car in reverse. She was going back to Brookhaven. Ella's heart pounded as she turned the car around, the wheels grinding against the pavement. Claire still stood in the road, her stitched mouth quivering as if she were trying to speak to warn her. Ella eased off the brakes and drove slowly toward town. As soon as she crossed back into Brookhaven's limits, the radio crackled again. But this time, it wasn't static. It was breathing, low, wet, right in her ear. Ella's fingers clenched around the wheel. Ignore it. She kept driving. The streets were wrong now. The houses, once perfect, had begun to shift. Front doors stood open. Windows had been smashed in. The neatly trimmed lawns were now rotting, weeds crawling over the pavement like veins. She passed the Rodriguez house. The curtains fluttered in the broken windows. No sign of Claire's family. A sick feeling twisted in Ella's stomach. Brookhaven wasn't just trapping people. It was consuming them. She turned on a sycamore lane. Her house still stood, the porch light still on, and waiting at the front steps, Claire. Ella parked and got out, moving cautiously. Claire lifted her hands. Slowly, painfully, she pulled at the stitches, tearing them open. Ella's stomach lurched at the sound, wet, ripping flesh. Claire gasped, her lips trembling, blood trickling down her chin. He's waiting. Ella's blood went cold. Claire's hollow eyes flicked up, and behind Ella, the porch light went out. The front door creaked open. Ella turned slowly. Inside the house, the darkness breathed. A shape moved, long too tall, limbs wrong, and then a voice. "Welcome home, Ella." The voice was deep, not human, not quite. Ella's chest tightened. Her legs screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. The thing in the doorway. It wasn't stepping out. It was waiting for her to come inside. Claire's breath hitched behind her. "Ella, don't go in." But even as she said it, the wind shifted. Ella felt it, something behind her. Not Claire, something else. She turned just in time to see the figure on the street. Jordan, still standing there, still watching. And now, his mouth wasn't empty anymore. It was smiling. Wide, too wide, more than human. Ella's stomach twisted. This was it, the choice. Run and never leave, or step inside and finally learn the truth. The house sighed. The darkness inside shifted, and Ella stepped through the door. The door slammed shut behind her. Ella stood frozen, the darkness swallowing every inch of the room. No light, no sound, only breathing. Not hers, his, the thing that had been waiting for her. Ella's pulse thundered in her ears. She reached for the light switch, click. Nothing. She stepped forward, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath her weight. The air inside felt thicker, heavy like stepping into deep water. Then a whisper. Low, amused. "You were always going to come back." Ella's breath hitched. "Who are you?" she whispered. The voice laughed. A deep, hollow sound that rattled inside her skull. And then the darkness moved. A shape pulled away from the shadows, taller than any man, its limbs wrong. And where its face should have been, there was nothing, just a shifting void. Ella staggered back. A memory, sharp and sudden, flashed through her mind. The house had been waiting for her. Since the moment she arrived, it had been calling her back. And the others, Claire, Jordan, the entire town, they were already part of it. Trapped inside, swallowed whole, just like she was about to be. The thing in the dark tilted its head. You were chosen, Ella. The shadows rippled, stretching toward her, curling around her wrists like unseen fingers. Pulling her in, Ella screamed. Claire stood on the sidewalk, staring at Ella's house. The lights were on, the porch untouched, like nothing had happened. But Claire knew the truth. Ella was gone, swallowed by the thing that controlled Brookhaven. Just like Jordan, just like all the others before her. Claire turned away, heart hammering, whispering to herself, "Please, let someone new move in soon." She had to warn them, before Brookhaven took them too. The days passed. Brookhaven remained the same. Neatly trimmed lawns, sun-drenched streets, laughter of children echoing down the sidewalks. But Ella's house was empty. No one spoke about her. No one seemed to remember her, except Claire. She watched the house from across the street, fingers clutching the arms of her rocking chair. Every night, she told herself to look away, to pretend. But she couldn't, because sometimes, just before dawn, she saw the curtains move. Saw something standing in the upstairs window, watching, waiting. A week later, the for sale sign appeared, bright and new. Planted firmly in the yard, Claire felt her stomach twist. Another one, another person would come, thinking they had found a quiet, perfect place to live. They would smile at the friendly neighbors. They would comment on how peaceful the street was. And then the house would wake up, just like it always did, just like it always would. Claire exhaled slowly. Across the street, the curtains shifted again. A shape stood behind them. Not Ella, something else. Something that looked like her. And then it smiled. 2 months later, a new car pulled into the driveway. A moving truck followed, its tires crunching against the pavement. Claire watched from her porch, heart sinking. They were here. A woman stepped out first, mid-30s, auburn hair tied back in a ponytail. She stretched, hands on her hips, surveying the house with quiet admiration. Behind her, a little boy tumbled out of the back seat, holding a stuffed rabbit in one hand. Claire's throat tightened. A child. Brookhaven liked children. A man joined them, wrapping an arm around his wife's shoulders. They laughed, their voices warm, alive. They didn't know, didn't see the thing in the window. Claire swallowed hard. She had to warn them, before it was too late, before they, too, disappeared. But as she stood, preparing to cross the street, a voice whispered behind her. "Welcome them, Claire." Cold dread slid down her spine. Slowly, she turned and saw Ella standing in the doorway of her own house. No, not Ella, the thing that had taken her shape. It tilted its head, eyes empty, a smile stretched too wide. You were chosen too. Claire's breath hitched. The shadow behind Ella stirred. Brookhaven was still hungry, and it would never let them go. Claire didn't run. She should have, but her legs wouldn't move. Ella, or what wore her face, stood in the doorway, head tilted, smiling with something not quite human behind her eyes. You were chosen too. The words slithered through Claire's mind, digging in deep. She swallowed hard. I'm not like you. The thing laughed. A whispery, dry sound that barely sounded human. "Oh, Claire," it murmured. "You've been part of Brookhaven for longer than you realize." The world around them seemed to shift. The trees leaned closer. The streetlights dimmed. And inside Ella's house, the shadows moved. Claire's stomach twisted. No, she wouldn't let this happen again. She turned back toward the new family. The boy stood on the porch now, staring at Ella's house. His stuffed rabbit dangled from his hand. And then he waved. Claire's heart dropped. Not at the boy, but at the thing waving back from the upstairs window. It had Ella's face. It had her face. It had all their faces. Brookhaven was waiting, and this time, it was ready to take more. The new family moved in on a sunny Friday afternoon. Claire watched from her porch, fingers digging into the wooden armrest of her chair. She had spent years pretending, looking away, keeping her head down. But this time, she couldn't ignore it. This time, she knew too much. She had seen Ella's thing, had heard it speak, had felt its presence crawl beneath her skin. And she knew that if she didn't act now, the new family would be swallowed whole, just like Ella, just like Jordan, just like all the others before them. But what could she do? No one ever listened. Brookhaven had a way of making people forget, of making things disappear. Even now, the street was filled with life, neighbors waving, children playing, dogs barking happily. It was all a lie, and only Claire could see through it. A cold breeze rushed past her, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. Her stomach twisted. She knew that feeling. Brookhaven was watching, and it knew what she was planning. That night, Claire barely slept. She could see the new house from her bedroom window. She could see the thing moving inside. And just past midnight, she heard the first scream. Not loud, just a small, startled sound. The kind of sound someone makes when they see something that shouldn't exist. Claire's breath hitched. The family was already starting to notice. She had to act fast. She threw on a jacket, heart pounding, and slipped outside. The air felt thicker. The street was too quiet, like Brookhaven itself was holding its breath. She reached the front porch and knocked, urgency making her fist shake. Footsteps approached. The door creaked open, revealing the mother. Auburn hair, tired eyes. Claire didn't know her name. Didn't need to. She just knew she had to get her out. "Listen to me," Claire whispered. "You need to leave. Right now." The woman blinked in confusion. "I what?" "You're in danger. Your whole family is. This house, this neighborhood, it's not what you think it is." A pause. Then, a small voice from behind the woman. "Mommy!" Claire's stomach dropped. The little boy stood in the hallway, clutching his stuffed rabbit. But his face was wrong. His eyes were too dark. His smile was too wide. Claire's blood ran cold. It was already happening. Brookhaven was taking them, one by one, and now Claire was next. Claire's breath hitched in her throat. The thing wearing the little boy's face smiled at her. "Mommy," it repeated, its voice slightly. Off, too echoey, too wrong. The woman, his mother, turned, her expression shifting from confusion to unease. "James, honey, go back to bed," she said softly. But James didn't move. He just stood there, staring at Claire, his stuffed rabbit dangling limply from his tiny hand. Claire forced herself to speak. "That's not your son." The woman whipped her head back to Claire, her eyes flashing with anger. "Excuse me? Listen to me." Claire's voice was barely a whisper. "Your son, your real son, is still here somewhere. But that thing standing in front of you, it's not him." James, or what looked like James, tilted its head. A slow, unnatural motion, like a puppet adjusting its strings. "Mommy," it said again, but this time, the voice shifted. It deepened, distorted, like something else was speaking through it. The woman gasped. She finally saw it, saw the thing in her child's skin. Claire grabbed her arm. "We have to leave. Right now." But then, James moved. Too fast. 1 second, he was standing in the hallway. The next, he was right in front of them. The door slammed shut, and the lights flickered out. Claire's stomach twisted. Brookhaven wasn't going to let them go. Not this time. The air grew thick, pressing against Claire's skin. The mother, she was frozen, staring at the thing that wore her son's face. Claire didn't have time to waste. She grabbed the woman's wrist and pulled her down the hall. "We have to move." The walls groaned. The floor beneath them shuddered. Brookhaven was waking up. James, or whatever it was now, tilted his head again, that awful grin still stretching his face. "You shouldn't have come here, Claire." The thing knew her name. Claire's chest tightened. She didn't stop running. She yanked the woman into the living room, searching for an exit. The front door was gone. Not locked. Gone, as if it had never existed. The windows? Bricked over. The fireplace? Sealed. Claire turned in a circle, her pulse racing. They were trapped. Brookhaven wasn't just watching anymore. It was swallowing them whole. And Claire realized she might not make it out this time. Claire's pulse hammered in her ears. The front door was gone. The windows bricked over. The walls breathed. She wasn't imagining it. The wallpaper rippled, pulsing like a living thing, as if the house itself had skin and veins beneath it. The woman, James's mother, was shaking beside her, whispering, "No, no, no. This isn't real." But it was, and it was hungry. Claire grabbed her arm. "We need to move." "Where?" The woman choked out. "There's no way out." Claire's eyes darted across the room, searching for any weakness in the house's grip. Then she spotted it, the basement door. It stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness. Not a good idea. Not safe. But right now it was their only choice. "Come on," Claire hissed, dragging the woman toward it. Behind them, James giggled, but the sound wasn't coming from his mouth. It came from the walls, from the ceiling, from inside the house. Claire pushed the woman through the basement door and followed, slamming it shut behind them. They plunged into total darkness. The sound of James's laughter echoed down the steps. "You can't hide," the voice whispered. The house was coming for them, and Claire knew they were running out of time. The basement was colder than it should have been. Not just cold, wrong. The air felt thick, damp, heavy, like it hadn't been touched by time. Claire fumbled for a light switch, but her fingers brushed against something wet. She yanked her hand back. A dim, flickering light bulb sputtered to life overhead. And then they saw the walls. Not concrete, not brick, flesh. The entire basement was lined with pale, pulsing tissue. Veins snaked through the ceiling, throbbing in slow, steady beats. The house was alive. The woman beside her screamed. Claire clamped a hand over her mouth. "Shut up! It's listening!" The woman trembled, tears streaming down her face. "What is this?" Claire shook her head. She didn't know, but she knew they couldn't stay. She scanned the basement for an escape, a vent, a window, anything. Then her gaze fell on the farthest wall. Something moved. A gap split open in the flesh, revealing a tunnel leading deeper underground. A heartbeat echoed through the walls. Claire swallowed hard. Whatever was down there, it was waiting for them, and they had no choice but to go forward. Claire's fingers trembled as she grabbed the woman's wrist and pulled her toward the tunnel. It was the only way. The flesh-like walls quivered as if sensing their presence. The heartbeat, slow, deep, and steady, pounded through the air. The woman resisted. "We can't go in there," she whispered, her voice laced with terror. Claire turned to her, locking eyes. "Do you see a better option?" The woman hesitated. Then, reluctantly, she shook her head. They stepped forward, into the dark. The tunnel walls were moist, warm, alive. Claire tried not to think about the slick, pulsing surface beneath her fingertips as she guided them deeper. The light above faded behind them, swallowed by the breathing darkness. And then a sound, a wet, shuffling noise. Claire froze. The woman let out a soft whimper, gripping Claire's arm. Something was ahead of them, something big. The tunnel suddenly widened, opening into a cavernous space. A faint, eerie glow illuminated the area, revealing rows of houses. Claire's breath caught in her throat. It was Brookhaven, but not the Brookhaven she knew. It was a perfect copy, a neighborhood beneath the neighborhood. The houses looked identical to the ones above, but their walls throbbed, as if they were breathing. Windows blinked like eyelids. Driveways curved like spines. And then she saw them, the people. Figures stood motionless in doorways, their faces blank, their bodies twitching. The missing neighbors, trapped, changed. Claire. The voice was right behind her. She turned and saw James. But it wasn't James anymore. His face was stretched too wide, his skin paper thin. His mouth, too many teeth. "Go back," he whispered. Claire grabbed the woman and ran. Behind them, the thing wearing James's face let out a horrible, wet shriek, and the houses started to move. Claire and the woman ran through the pulsating streets of the underground Brookhaven. The ground beneath them was warm, almost spongy. Shadows stirred between the houses, things moving, watching. A terrible realization hit Claire. Brookhaven wasn't built on land. It was built on this, a thing, a creature, a living, breathing entity, and they were inside it. A deep, guttural rumble rolled through the air like a giant exhaling. The neighborhood shook. The people, or what was left of them, turned. Their faces cracked open, revealing tooth-filled maws. The woman beside Claire screamed. Claire grabbed her hand and kept running. But up ahead, the street ended. A massive, pulsating structure stood in their path. A house, but wrong. Its doors stretched open like a gaping mouth. And inside, darkness. Moving, waiting. A voice, deep, ancient, and knowing, filled the space. You should not have come here. Claire took a step back, and the house inhaled. Claire tried to resist, but the pull was too strong. The massive house, a living thing, breathed her in. Wind rushed past her, sucking her toward its gaping doorway. The woman beside her clawed at the ground, screaming as her fingers tore through the soft, pulsing earth. It was swallowing them whole. Claire grabbed for anything, a post, a railing, a ledge, but her hands found only flesh. Then the drop. She tumbled forward into darkness, falling. Claire landed hard on something soft. The air was thick with moisture, the walls slick and pulsing. A cavern stretched around her, a stomach, a womb, a prison. The woman was gone. Or maybe he had been absorbed. Claire forced herself to stand, her legs trembling. She had to get out. Shapes moved in the dim light, figures twitching. She gasped. They were people. Brookhaven's missing residents, half digested, their bodies fused to the walls. Their eyes, wide and unseeing, turned toward her. And then they screamed, a horrible, shrill sound that ripped through her bones. The walls shook. The house, the creature, knew she was here. Something shifted in the dark. Claire turned just in time to see it emerge. A figure too tall, too thin, its limbs wrong, stretching unnaturally. It had no face, only a gaping, black hole where its mouth should be. James, or what was left of him. Claire. His voice slithered through the air. She ran. Claire sprinted through the fleshy corridors, her breath ragged. The walls closed in, pulsing, shifting, trying to trap her. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. Then she saw it. At the center of the cavern, a massive, beating heart. Black veins stretched from it, running through the walls, feeding the entire neighborhood. Claire's stomach turned. Brookhaven wasn't just built on this thing. Brookhaven was part of it, and the only way out was to kill it. Behind her, James's twisted form crawled closer. The walls screamed. Claire grabbed a sharp piece of metal from the ground, a rusted pipe, slick with blood. She had one chance. She turned and ran straight for the heart. Claire lunged forward, gripping the rusted pipe with both hands. The massive heart throbbed before her, its surface slick and writhing, veins pulsing as if sensing the threat. Behind her, James, or what remained of him, let out an unearthly wail. The walls closed in, shifting, twisting, trying to stop her. Claire didn't hesitate. She plunged the pipe into the heart with all her strength. The reaction was instant. The heart convulsed, a thick black liquid spurting from the wound. A low, guttural scream erupted from all around her, echoing through the monstrous cavern. The ground shook violently, nearly knocking her off her feet. Brookhaven was dying. Claire ripped the pipe free and struck again. And again. Each blow sent waves of pain through the living structure. The veins in the walls burst, spilling dark, steaming fluid. The figures trapped in the walls, the missing neighbors, began to dissolve, their bodies melting away as if they had never existed. Claire turned, searching for an exit, but then the floor gave out beneath her. She was falling again. When Claire opened her eyes, she was lying on grass. The sky above her was bright and cloudless. Her breath hitched as she sat up. She was back in Brookhaven. The houses stood perfectly intact, neat and suburban, as if nothing had happened. But something was wrong. The streets were empty. No neighbors. No children playing. Only an eerie, unnatural silence. Claire pushed herself to her feet, her heart pounding. She turned to look at her own house. The front door was open, and then a voice behind her, "Claire." She turned slowly. James stood there, whole, smiling. But his eyes, they were all wrong. They weren't human anymore. Claire's breath caught in her throat. James stood there, his smile too perfect, too still. Everything about him looked normal. But his eyes, black, empty, endless. Something was wearing his skin. James! Her voice came out in a whisper. He stepped forward. It's over now. The air felt wrong. Thick. Heavy. Claire took a step back. The street was exactly as it had been when she first moved in. The trees, the houses, the mailbox at the curb, but the silence was suffocating. Where is everyone? She asked. James tilted his head. They're here. You just can't see them yet. Claire's stomach twisted. She looked at her own hands. They were shaking. Something about the air, the way it pressed against her skin. She wasn't supposed to be here. She had destroyed the heart, hadn't she? So, why was Brookhaven still standing? Unless she wasn't back in the real world. He was inside the house's mind. Claire clenched her fists. She had to wake up. She turned and ran. James's voice followed her. Claire, don't fight it. The street stretched too long, too endless. The houses blurred together, melting, shifting. The air shimmered, like the surface of a distorted mirror. Claire's foot hit something solid. She fell hard onto the pavement. Pain shot up her palms, but the ground wasn't concrete anymore. It was warm, wet, pulsing. A low, rhythmic heartbeat echoed beneath her. She was still inside. Her stomach turned. The illusion was breaking down, but the house wasn't letting go. It was trying to keep her here. She pushed up, stumbling forward, and that's when she saw it. At the end of the street, a doorway. It hovered, flickering like static, leading into absolute darkness. A way out, or a trap. Behind her, James wasn't smiling anymore. His face twisted, his mouth stretching too wide. Claire! His voice warped, layering over itself. You belong here now. His skin rippled. Something else was inside of him. Something that had been waiting. Claire sprinted for the door. The street melted around her. Houses crumbling. Trees dissolving into dust. She jumped and fell into the dark. Claire's eyes snapped open. She was on the floor of her real house. Cold. Silent. Empty. Her body ached, but she forced herself up. Brookhaven was dead. The neighborhood outside her window was in ruins, abandoned, overgrown, lifeless. She staggered to the door, stepping outside. The air was thin, stale. The street was full of husks, houses that had rotted from the inside, hollow and dead. It had never been real. Brookhaven had been a feeding ground, and Claire had barely escaped. She turned, heart hammering. James's house was still standing, but the door was open, and from the darkness inside, a voice whispered, Claire! She ran. Claire ran until her legs burned, until the cold air seared her lungs. She didn't stop until she was far beyond Brookhaven's borders. But when she finally collapsed on the side of an abandoned highway, panting, she realized something that made her blood turn to ice. She was not alone. The silence around her was too deep. The kind of silence that only happens when something is watching. Slowly, Claire turned her head. Across the road, standing just beyond the reach of the streetlights, James was there. Not running, not attacking, just standing, too still, too patient. And then he smiled. Claire's hands curled into fists. You're not real. James tilted his head, his expression calm. Aren't I? His voice was soft, familiar, the exact way he had sounded before. That was the worst part, because for a split second, she wanted to believe it was really him. No, she whispered. James took a step forward. Claire stumbled back, but then she noticed something. The pavement beneath his feet didn't crack. The grass didn't bend. He wasn't really here. A projection, a shadow. But if he was still appearing to her, that meant she wasn't free. Brookhaven was inside her now, and it would never let her go. James smiled wider. We'll see each other again soon. Then, just like that, he was gone. For days, Claire kept moving. She found a small town, stayed in cheap motels, kept the lights on at night. She tried to tell herself she was safe. But every time she closed her eyes, she dreamed of Brookhaven. The whispering walls, the pulsing heart, the feeling of being watched. And then, one night, she woke up to the sound of something tapping on her window. Her stomach dropped. Slowly, she turned her head. The motel window was fogged over, but there, just on the other side of the glass, a handprint. Still wet, still fresh. And then a voice. "Claire, it's time to come home." Brookhaven was still waiting, and it was coming for her. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the wet handprint on the motel window, her pulse hammering in her ears. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The voice had been inside the room. Slowly, she turned her head toward the motel door. It was unlocked. Her stomach twisted. Had she forgotten to lock it? Or had something opened it? A soft creak sounded behind her. Claire spun around, but the room was empty. The air felt wrong, heavy, the same suffocating pressure from Brookhaven. Her heart pounded. She had to leave. Now! Claire grabbed her bag, but as she turned toward the door, the lights flickered. And for a fraction of a second, she saw him. James! Standing in the corner of the room, smiling. But his eyes were gone. Just dark, endless voids. The lights went out completely, and Claire ran. She didn't stop running until she reached the main road. The night was thick with fog, swirling unnaturally around the empty streets. Claire's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. No signal. Of course. She turned in frantic circles. There had to be a way out, some escape, and then she saw it. A gas station. Lights buzzing faintly, too dim, too flickering. But there was a phone booth outside. Claire sprinted toward it, slamming the door shut behind her. She grabbed the receiver, heart pounding. A dial tone. Relief flooded her chest as she punched in the first number that came to mind, her mother's. The phone rang once, twice, then a click. Someone had picked up, but no one spoke. Claire's breath shuddered. "Mom," she whispered. A long pause. Then Claire, the voice on the other end, rasped. James's voice. She slammed the phone down. The glass of the booth cracked. A reflection, James standing right behind her. Claire screamed. She shoved the door open and bolted toward the gas station. But when she reached the entrance, the sign on the door had changed. It no longer said open. It said, "Welcome back to Brookhaven." Claire staggered backward. No, this wasn't happening. She turned to run back toward the road, but the fog had thickened. Swirling, pulsing, closing in. The buildings around her shifted, warped. Streetlights bent at unnatural angles. The pavement cracked open, revealing something dark and pulsing beneath. She never left. Brookhaven had let her think she escaped, but she had been inside it the whole time. Claire's breath came in sharp gasps. How was this possible? And then she heard them. Footsteps. Not just one person. Many. She turned, and in the fog, she saw figures emerging. All the people who had vanished. Her neighbors. David and Claire Rodriguez. Mrs. Grayson. The children. All of them. Smiling. Staring. And in front of them all, James. His empty eyes locked onto hers. "Welcome home, Claire." Claire stumbled back. The town was changing around her. Buildings stretched too tall, warping like reflections in broken glass. The streetlights flickered, twisting into skeletal shapes. The fog was thick, pressing in like hands against her skin. And the people, her neighbors, her friends, weren't real. Their eyes were too wide, their smiles too fixed. James stepped forward. "Why do you keep running, Claire?" His voice was calm, patient, like this was just a game. Claire's hands clenched into fists. "This isn't real," she whispered. James tilted his head. "You always say that," he murmured. "But you're still here, aren't you?" Claire's breath hitched. He was right. She had been running, but she never escaped. She was still inside Brookhaven, trapped in its grip, but that meant she could still break free. Claire scanned the warped town, searching. If this place was an illusion, there had to be a weak spot, a crack, a door, something. And then she saw it, a narrow alleyway, hidden between two shifting buildings. It hadn't been there before. Her pulse hammered. James followed her gaze. His smile faltered. Claire ran. The crowd of eerie, frozen-faced neighbors lunged for her. Hands grasped at her arms, her hair, Too cold, too strong. She twisted free, shoving through them. James's voice rang out behind her. "Claire, wait!" But she didn't stop. He sprinted into the alley. The walls bent inward. The air buzzed with something electric, something wrong, but at the very end of the alley, there was a door. Old, wooden, with a rusted handle. It pulsed like a heartbeat. Claire reached for it. Behind her, James screamed, but his voice was different now. Not calm, not patient, desperate. "Claire, don't!" She grabbed the handle, and the world shattered. Claire gasped awake. Sunlight. She was lying in bed. Her bed. In her house. Brookhaven. Her breath came in ragged gulps as she sat up, hands clutching the blanket. Had it all been a dream? The warp town? The fog? James? Her heart pounded as she looked around. Everything looked normal. No twisted buildings. No pulsing streets. Just her room. But then a whisper. Soft. Almost imperceptible. Coming from the closet. "Claire, wake up." Her blood turned to ice. She was still dreaming. Still trapped. Brookhaven wasn't done with her yet. Claire froze. The whisper came again from inside the closet. "Wake up." Her throat went dry. This wasn't a dream. It was worse. She had only peeled back a layer. Slowly, she slid her legs out of bed. The floor was ice cold. Her body felt heavier, like something was pressing down on her, trying to keep her here. Claire swallowed hard and stood up. The closet door was ajar. A sliver of darkness stretched beyond the wooden frame. Too deep, too wrong. A part of her wanted to run, but another part of her, the part that had survived this long, knew she had to face it. She took a step forward, then another. The whispering stopped. She reached for the handle, and the door swung open on its own. The closet was wrong. It didn't lead to the back wall. It led somewhere else. An endless black tunnel stretched beyond the doorway, pulsing like something alive. Claire's pulse hammered. "Wake up!" The voice was louder now. Closer. Claire stepped forward. As soon as her foot crossed the threshold, the floor vanished. She was falling. The darkness swallowed her whole. Claire tumbled, her scream lost in the void. Then impact. She landed hard on something cold and wet. A floor. She gasped, pushing herself up. Dim, flickering light surrounded her. The air was thick with a rotten scent. Claire's stomach turned. She knew this place. She had seen it before. The basement. The same one she had found beneath the Miller house. The same one where she had seen the old photographs. The same one where James had a hand gripped her wrist. Claire jerked back, gasping. James! But he wasn't like before. He was hollow. His skin was stretched too tight, his eyes nothing but black pits. "Claire," he whispered, "you're almost there." Her heart raced. Almost where? James's grip tightened. The center. And then the walls around them melted away. Claire staggered back. She was no longer in the basement. No longer in her house. No longer anywhere she recognized. The world shifted around her, flickering between moments. A street she had walked down yesterday vanished. A house that had always been there erased. Brookhaven was coming undone. And in the middle of it all, a door. Massive, ancient, breathing. James stood beside her, his hollow eyes locked on hers. "This is it," he whispered. "The way out." Claire's chest tightened. He was lying. She knew it, but she also knew she had no choice. She reached for the door, and Brookhaven screamed. Claire's fingers barely grazed the door before the world convulsed. A deep, guttural scream tore through the air, Brookhaven itself fighting back. The houses warped. The sky rippled. James's form flickered, his hollow eyes stretching into something else. Something not human. "Claire," he whispered, his voice now 1,000 voices. "You don't understand. You're not supposed to leave." Claire's stomach twisted. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere else to go. She threw her weight against the door. It was cold, pulsing, alive. The moment it cracked open, everything stopped. And then she was pulled through. Claire hit the ground hard. Grass. Real, damp, cold grass. She gasped, lungs burning. The air was crisp, fresh. She was outside, not in Brookhaven. not anywhere she recognized. A dense forest stretched before her, trees gnarled and ancient. Mist curled around the trunks, thick and unnatural. Behind her, nothing. The door was gone. Brookhaven had vanished. Claire's pulse pounded. She had escaped, or had she just stepped into something worse? Then, the whisper. "You're almost there." Claire turned, heart hammering. A figure stood in the mist. Not James, not anyone she had ever seen before, but it was waiting for her. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The figure in the mist stood unnaturally still. Its form was blurred, shifting like it wasn't fully there. But its eyes, deep, hollow voids, were locked on her. "You're almost there." The whisper wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from inside her own head. Claire's pulse pounded. She took a slow step back, her boots sinking into the damp earth. The figure moved, not like a person. It twitched, a glitch in reality. Then it started walking toward her. Claire turned and ran. The forest was wrong. No matter how far Claire ran, the trees never seemed to change. The mist thickened, swallowing everything behind her. But she could hear it, the footsteps, matching hers, growing closer. She broke into a full sprint, branches whipping against her skin. Ahead, a clearing, a glimmer of something familiar. She burst through the tree line and staggered to a stop. Her house was there, right in front of her, untouched, perfect, like she had never left. Claire's chest tightened. No. She had escaped. Hadn't she? Behind her, the footsteps stopped. She turned. The figure was gone, but the whisper wasn't. "You were never meant to leave." Claire swallowed hard. The door to her house swung open. A dark, yawning void. She knew what it meant. Brookhaven wasn't just a place. It was alive, and it wanted her back. Claire stood at the threshold, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The house was waiting. She could feel it like a heartbeat, a pulse in the very walls. The door stood open, revealing nothing but blackness. Not shadows, not darkness. Something deeper, something alive. Her entire body screamed at her to run. But Brookhaven had already wrapped its fingers around her, and it wouldn't let go. "You were never meant to leave." The whisper slithered down her spine. Claire clenched her fists. No, she wasn't going back. She turned to run and slammed straight into a wall. The forest was gone. The sky, the mist, everything. She wasn't outside anymore. She was inside the house, back in her living room. The furniture was where she had left it. The air smelled of coffee and pine-scented candles. The clock on the wall read 10:17 p.m., exactly the time she had left. Her stomach turned to ice. She had never left. Brookhaven had let her believe she escaped. It had given her hope, only to rip it away. "You were never meant to leave." A creak echoed from the hallway. Claire whipped around. Something was here, waiting for her, watching. She swallowed hard, her heart beat a hammer in her chest. She had one choice: find a way to break the loop, or become a part of it, forever. Claire took a slow, trembling step back. She was home, but it wasn't her home anymore. Something in the air had changed. It felt heavier, denser, like the walls were pressing in on her, breathing in sync with her own shaky breaths. A sound came from the hallway. Not footsteps, a dragging. Slow, deliberate. Claire's blood turned to ice. "You were never meant to leave." The whisper came from everywhere at once. Claire spun toward the front door, her fingers grasping the handle. She twisted, pulled, locked. Of course. Her stomach twisted as she turned back toward the hallway. The dragging sound had stopped. Something was there, waiting, watching, and then a shadow moved. A tall, distorted shape slid forward from the darkness. Not stepping, gliding. Claire backed away, her breath coming in rapid, panic gasps. The figure tilted its head. It was too tall, its limbs too long, its face not there at all. And then it spoke, but not with words, with her own voice. "You never left, Claire." Her body went rigid. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She squeezed her eyes shut, whispering to herself, "Wake up, wake up, wake up." A cold breath brushed against her ear. "You never left." Claire screamed. Her body lurched backward on instinct. She stumbled, her back hitting the wall. No, not the wall. A door. A door that hadn't been there before. The handle was ice cold. She didn't think. Didn't hesitate. She yanked it open and ran. Darkness swallowed her whole. Claire fell. Not down, but through. The sensation was impossible, like she was sinking into nothing. Then impact. She hit the ground, chest heaving. The air smelled different. Claire blinked rapidly, trying to adjust. A single, flickering light bulb dangled from the ceiling. The room was small, cramped, and lined with photographs. Dozens, hundreds, all of them, of her, at the grocery store, walking down the street, sitting on her porch, sleeping in her bed. Claire's stomach twisted into a knot of pure dread. Someone had been watching her for a long, long time. Then she saw the final photograph, pinned to the opposite wall. A new picture of her, standing right here. In this room, Claire turned slowly and saw the camera, recording her. Claire's heartbeat thundered in her ears. The camera's red light blinked. Recording. She wasn't alone. She could feel it. The air was charged, like the room itself was holding its breath. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the pinned photograph. It was still warm, freshly printed, as if someone had just taken it. A creak echoed behind her. Claire froze. The door, the one she had stumbled through, was gone. In its place was nothing but a solid wall. The walls of the tiny room began to pulse, moving, breathing, shifting. And then the camera spoke. A voice crackled through its speaker. Her own voice. "You never left, Claire." She spun around. A tall shadow stood in the corner, just out of reach of the flickering light. Watching. Waiting. Then it stepped forward. Claire's breath came in shallow gasps. The figure moved like liquid, its limbs bending wrong. Too smooth, too inhuman. But when it stepped into the dim light, she saw its face. And screamed. Because it was her. Her own face. Her own body. But not right. The eyes were too dark. The mouth too wide. And when it smiled, her skin crawled. "You never left." The voice wasn't coming from its mouth. It was coming from inside Claire's own head. The walls lurched. The photographs peeled away, revealing something underneath. Mirrors. Hundreds of them. Claire whirled around, her reflection multiplying in every direction. But they weren't right. Some moved when she didn't. Some stared back with empty, black eyes. And some were laughing. Claire clutched her head, her thoughts unraveling. She had to get out. There had to be a way out. She turned, but the figure was gone. In its place was a door, slightly open. Beyond it, darkness. Claire's lungs burned as she forced herself to move. Every step felt heavier, like the room itself was trying to hold on to her. She reached the door, paused. Behind her, the mirrors shifted. And then, one of her reflections stepped forward. It wasn't following her movements anymore. It was approaching, and it whispered, "Are you sure you're the real one?" Claire's blood turned to ice. The reflection smiled and lunged. Claire barely had time to react. Her reflection lunged, its hands clawing at her, its eyes burning with something wrong. She stumbled backward, hitting the doorframe. The other Claire's grin widened unnaturally. "You took my place." The words slithered into Claire's mind. Her stomach turned. No, this wasn't possible. She was real. She was herself. The reflection's fingers wrapped around her wrist. Cold, too cold, like touching glass. Claire yanked away, breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The mirrors shuddered. The walls groaned. The air thickened, as if the house itself was deciding, "You don't belong here." The voice came from everywhere. The reflection lunged again, and Claire jumped through the door. She fell, through darkness, through nothing. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, and then light. Her body hit the floor hard. Cold tile, a sterile, flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead. She was in a hospital. No, a mental institution. The walls were bare, lined with padded restraints. A large mirror stretched across the room. Claire pushed herself up, dizzy, disoriented. Something was wrong. The mirror, she saw her reflection, but it wasn't moving. It was just watching, and then it smiled. Claire's stomach dropped. The door behind her clicked. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. A voice, calm, professional, spoke. "She's awake." The door swung open. A woman in a white coat entered, clipboard in hand. She smiled, but her eyes held nothing. "Welcome back, Claire," she said. Claire's mouth went dry. Where? Where am I?" The woman glanced at the mirror. A slow, knowing smile. "You've been here a long time." Claire's pulse pounded. No, that wasn't true. She had just moved into Brookhaven. She had just the Miller house. The whispers. The thing wearing her face. Claire's head spun. This isn't real. The doctor tilted her head. "Are you sure?" She turned the clipboard toward Claire, and Claire's breath caught in her throat. It was a patient file. Her own. Name, Claire Marshadman State. 8 years ago. Claire shook her head violently. No, that's not." She turned to the mirror. Her reflection was grinning. It raised a hand, pressed a finger to its lips. "Oh!" Claire screamed. Claire's scream echoed through the sterile white room, bouncing off the walls like a sound trapped in an empty void. The doctor didn't react. She simply clicked her pen and jotted something down. "You seem agitated," she noted, her tone clinical. "Cold." Claire's chest heaved. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Her hands clenched into fists. She remembered Brookhaven. She remembered moving in, meeting Mrs. Grayson, talking to David and Claire Rodriguez. She remembered the Miller house. A sudden, sharp pain stabbed at her skull. Her vision blurred. She collapsed to her knees. Memories began pouring in, but they weren't hers. A different life, a different version of her. Flashes of sitting in this very room. Nurses watching her through a glass window. A psychiatrist scribbling notes. A voice telling her, over and over again, "You have to let go of the delusions, Claire." Her stomach twisted. Was this the truth? Or was it another lie? Her eyes darted to the mirror. Her reflection was still there, still watching, and it whispered, "Wake up." Claire forced herself to stand. "I want to leave." The doctor sighed, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "We've been through this before, Claire." She gestured toward the walls. "No windows. No doors. There is nowhere to go." Claire's pulse pounded. The room suddenly felt smaller, tighter, trapped. "This isn't real." The doctor tilted her head. "What isn't real?" Claire opened her mouth, then stopped, because something had changed. A new shadow stretched across the floor. A door. Not just any door. The front door to her house. The one from Brookhaven. The doctor didn't seem to notice. Claire swallowed hard. This was her chance. Her only chance. She bolted. The doctor shouted, but Claire didn't stop. Her hands grabbed the knob, twisted, and the world fell apart. Claire hit the ground hard. Grass. Dirt. The scent of autumn leaves filled her lungs. She gasped, rolling onto her back. Brookhaven. She was on her front lawn. The sun had set, casting a reddish glow over the neighborhood. But something was wrong. The houses were distorted. Windows warped, doors slightly too tall. And the Miller house, it was gone, as if it had never been there. A whisper brushed against her ear. "Did you really escape?" Claire's blood ran cold. Slowly, she turned. And there, standing at the edge of her yard, was herself. But not right. The too wide grin. The dark, empty eyes. The reflection. It lifted a hand and waved. Claire's body refused to move. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her reflection stood at the edge of the yard, still grinning. It tilted its head, as if studying her. "You made it back," it whispered, voice carrying on the wind. "But did you really escape?" The street was silent. No neighbors. No cars. No life. Just her. And it, Claire staggered backward, her heart hammering in her chest. "You're not real." The reflection laughed. Not just a sound, a feeling that pressed into Claire's skin like nails scratching at the inside of her skull. "I've been more real than you for a long time." Claire's mind reeled. She had escaped the hospital, hadn't she? She dug her nails into her palm. The pain was real. The ground beneath her feet was real. This had to be real. Her reflection took a step closer. Claire's breath caught. Something was wrong with the way it moved, like a marionette with tangled strings. Jolted, offbeat. "You don't belong here anymore," it murmured. Claire whirled around and bolted for her front door. The door swung open before she touched it. Claire stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. Her chest rose and fell in ragged gasps. Silence. The house was dark, cold, empty. Her hands trembled as she flicked on the light. The bulbs buzzed, flickered, then steadied. The living room looked the same furniture, the same arrangement, but it felt wrong, like an artist had painted a perfect replica, but without a soul. A chill slid down her spine. The air smelled stale, like a place that hadn't been lived in for years. Claire took a cautious step forward. The floorboards didn't creak. Her house had always creaked. Her stomach twisted. Something moved in the hallway. A shadow, long and stretching, as if cast by someone just out of sight. Her pulse pounded. "Hello?" No answer. But then a whisper, right behind her. "You shouldn't have come back." Claire spun around. Nothing. But the mirror in the hallway, it had changed. Her reflection wasn't facing her. It was turned to the side, staring down the hallway, as if it saw something she didn't. Claire's breath hitched. The reflection didn't move, didn't mimic her. It just stood there, watching. Not her, something else. A shadow shifted at the end of the hallway. Claire swallowed hard. She didn't want to look, didn't want to know what was there. But her reflection turned its head toward her and grinned. Then it reached forward, its hands pressed against the glass, like it was trapped, like it was trying to push through. Claire took a shaky step backward. "You don't belong here anymore," it whispered again. But this time, the voice came from inside the mirror. A hand burst through the glass. Claire screamed. Claire's scream died in her throat as the hand shot out of the mirror. Ice-cold fingers wrapped around her wrist. Yanked. The room tilted. The air ripped apart. Claire stumbled forward. Her body slammed against the glass and fell through. She hit the ground hard. Not wood, not carpet, glass. Shattered shards beneath her hands. But they didn't cut. They felt soft, like grains of sand. Claire sucked in a sharp breath. She was inside the mirror. Or no, somewhere else. Brookhaven stretched before her, but wrong. The sky was the color of a bruised sunset, deep purples and reds that pulsed like a living thing. The houses looked abandoned, not just empty, forgotten. Their paint peeled in thick, rotting strips. Windows gaped like open mouths, black and endless. The streetlights flickered, buzzing with something that wasn't electricity. Claire's stomach twisted. This wasn't her neighborhood, but it was a mirror image, a rotting reflection. A whisper brushed against her ear. "You've always been here, Claire." She spun around and froze, because standing in the street were her neighbors. Or what was left of them. Claire's pulse pounded. The figures stood motionless in the dim glow of the flickering streetlight. David Rodriguez, Claire Rodriguez, their two kids, Sophia and Max, Mrs. Grayson, more figures down the road, neighbors she had seen every day. But their faces were gone. Just smooth, featureless skin where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should be. Their heads twitched at unnatural angles. Their bodies swayed, and then they started to walk toward her. Slow, deliberate. Their movements jerked, as if something inside them was struggling to control their limbs. Claire backpedaled. Her breath came in gasps. No. Her foot caught on something. She collapsed onto the pavement. The hollow ones moved faster. Hands reached, long, thin fingers stretching toward her. Claire scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the ground. One of them, Mrs. Grayson, tilted her head as if listening. And then she spoke, but not in her own voice. The voice was Claire's. "You shouldn't have come back." Claire screamed. Her body moved before her mind did. She bolted, feet pounding against the pavement. The hollow ones didn't run. They just walked. But no matter how far she ran, they were never further away. As if the street itself was stretching, warping, twisting around her. And then she saw it. The Miller house. Still standing. Untouched. The only house that looked exactly the same. Waiting. Claire veered toward it. Her breath burned in her lungs. The hollow ones whispered behind her, voices overlapping, hissing inside her skull. "Come back, Claire. You were never supposed to leave. Let go." She lunged for the front door, gripped the handle, turned it, and ripped it open. Darkness swallowed her whole. Claire stumbled inside, slamming the door behind her. The silence was thick, pressing against her ears like she had been dropped underwater. Her chest heaved. Her pulse thundered. Outside, the hollow ones stood at the edge of the porch, waiting. They didn't try to enter, didn't knock, just watched. Or they would have if they had eyes. Claire swallowed hard. The air inside the Miller house was wrong. Not cold, not warm, just still, like the house itself was holding its breath. A shiver crawled up her spine. She turned. The interior was immaculate. Unlike the rest of Brookhaven, which had decayed into a rotting reflection, the Miller house looked perfect. No dust, no cobwebs. The furniture was untouched, as if someone had just been sitting there. The kitchen light flickered. A plate sat on the counter with a half-eaten sandwich on it. Claire's stomach twisted. She took a step forward and froze. The floor sighed beneath her feet. Not creaked, not groaned. Sighed, like something beneath the house had just exhaled. Her breath hitched. Something moved down the hallway. A shadow. Not fast, not slow, just gliding. Claire's fingers curled into fists. She had a choice. Go back outside or go deeper into the house. She steeled herself and took a step forward. The hallway light buzzed overhead. She reached the first door of bedroom. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. And then a whisper. Claire. Her stomach dropped. She knew that voice. She hadn't heard it in years. It was her mother's. Claire's hand trembled as she pushed the door open. Inside her childhood bedroom. Not the room she had in Brookhaven. Not the place she had moved to as an adult. No, this was the room she had as a little girl. The same pastel blue walls. The same old rocking horse in the corner. The bed was made with her favorite blanket, a deep red quilt her mother had sewn for her. Claire's heart raced. This was impossible. Her childhood home was states away. Hadn't been hers for decades. Claire! She whipped around. The closet door was ajar. Darkness pooled inside. The voice had come from there. Claire's mouth was dry. Her fingers twitched. "Mom," she whispered. Silence. Then, the closet door creaked open further. A figure stepped out. Claire's breath caught in her throat. It was her mother, or something that looked like her mother. But her face was blurry, shifting, like a photo that couldn't quite come into focus. Claire backed away. "You're not real," she choked out. The figure tilted its head, and then it smiled. A too wide, unnatural grin. And in her mother's voice, it whispered, "Neither are you." Claire's breath hitched. The thing wearing her mother's face took a step forward. Her stomach twisted as the air in the room thickened, pressing against her skin like unseen hands. "Neither are you." The words echoed inside her skull. Claire stumbled back, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. She crashed against the nightstand, sending a porcelain lamp shattering to the floor. But she barely heard it. Her pulse pounded. The thing in front of her shifted, its body warped like a smear of paint on glass. Not quite real, not quite solid. Claire shook her head. "No," she whispered. "You're lying." The smile didn't falter. "If I am," the thing said, voice still a perfect replica of her mother's, "then why are you still here?" The walls of the bedroom rippled, a silent vibration that made the air hum. The rocking horse tilted forward with an eerie creak. The light overhead flickered, casting warped shadows against the walls. The figure took another step, and another. Claire's breath hitched in her throat. She turned and ran. She burst into the hallway, heart hammering. The Miller house had changed. The hallway stretched longer, warping like melted wax. Doors lined the walls, dozens of them. Some she recognized, some she didn't. Her childhood bedroom, her college dorm. A door with no handle, a door that dripped black sludge beneath the crack. Claire whirled around. The door she had just come through was gone. No, not gone. Replaced. A different door stood in its place now. One she had never seen before. The whisper started again. You were never supposed to leave. Come home, Claire. Let go. She clenched her fists. No, she hissed. I am real. I am real. A laugh slithered down the hallway. It was every voice she had ever known, blended together, speaking in unison. Then prove it. The light overhead exploded. Darkness swallowed the hall. And then the doors began to open. Claire backed away. One by one, the doors creaked open. Something moved inside them. Something watching. The first door, her childhood bedroom, shuddered open just an inch. Inside, she saw herself. A little girl, curled in bed, blanket pulled up to her chin. But her eyes were wide open, staring straight at Claire, unblinking. A slow, mechanical voice came from her lips. You left me. Claire's stomach churned. She staggered back. The second door opened. Her college dorm. Inside, a version of herself lying on the floor, motionless, unmoving, face turned toward the ceiling, eyes glassy and distant. Dead. Claire choked on a breath. No, she whispered. This isn't real. The voices laughed. Not yet. The next door swung wide. A hospital room. A figure in a bed. Hooked to machines. Her face. Her body. Eyes closed. Unmoving. A beeping monitor droned in the background. Claire froze. Everything tilted. Her vision blurred at the edges. The pieces clicked into place. A memory. A crash. A hospital room. A doctor whispering. She may not wake up. Her breath caught. Because suddenly she knew. She knew what the Miller house was. She knew why it had called her back. She wasn't trapped. She was never here at all. Brookhaven. The hollow ones. The whispers. They were all the same thing. A place between. A limbo. She was the one who was vanishing. The house shook. The walls cracked. The hallways shrank. The doors slamming shut one by one. The house was collapsing, forcing her to decide. The hospital door was still open. The beeping monitor was slowing, fading. A final whisper coiled through the dark. Wake up, Claire. Claire squeezed her eyes shut and chose. The Miller house was coming apart. The walls buckled, splintering like rotting wood. The air rippled, pulsing with something ancient, something hungry. And Claire, she stood on the edge of a decision. Her body felt split in two. One foot in the hallway of doors, the other in the hospital room. She could hear the heartbeat monitor from the hospital, slowing, fading. If she stepped through that door, if she left this house, would she wake up, or would she simply disappear? The whispers slithered through the collapsing walls. Stay. You belong here. The real world doesn't need you. The last part hit hard, because wasn't that the truth? She had no family waiting for her. No home. Just an empty apartment and a life she had never been able to piece together. Maybe this was better. Maybe she should just know. Claire clenched her fists. The Miller house wasn't real. Brookhaven wasn't real. These voices weren't real. But she was, and she would not let them take her. Not now. Not ever. The house shrieked. The ceiling collapsed inward, black tendrils writhing like smoke. The walls cracked, revealing a gaping void, an endless abyss beyond. Claire sprinted for the hospital door. The floor cracked beneath her feet, splintering like ice. She jumped and fell forward, through the door, through the dark, through a gasp. Cold air rushed into her lungs. Her body jerked, muscles stiff and unresponsive. She was lying on something soft, something real. Bright lights burned behind her eyelids. Beeping. Voices. Someone saying her name. She opened her eyes, and the first thing she saw was the hospital ceiling. The hospital room was quiet. Machines hummed beside her. A dull ache throbbed in her skull, and her body felt weak, weightless. She turned her head. A nurse stood near the monitors, writing something on a clipboard. When she noticed Claire was awake, her pen clattered to the floor. "Oh my God," the nurse whispered. "You're awake." Claire swallowed, her throat dry. She tried to speak, but only a croak came out. The nurse rushed to the door, calling for a doctor. Within seconds, people flooded the room, checking machines, asking questions, tears in their eyes. One doctor held her hand and said, "Claire, can you hear me? You've been in a coma for 6 weeks." 6 weeks. Her stomach plummeted. Her memories felt disjointed, torn apart at the edges. She had been in a car accident. She remembered flashes, the impact, the sirens, the darkness. And then Brookhaven. She sucked in a sharp breath. The Miller house. The hollow ones. The whispers. It had all felt so real. But it wasn't. Was it? She hesitated. Then, with effort, she forced out the only question that mattered. "Where is Brookhaven?" The doctor frowned. "Brookhaven?" Claire nodded. "The neighborhood. I was there." The doctor exchanged a glance with the nurse. "Claire," he said gently, "there is no Brookhaven." The world tilted. Her chest tightened. No, that wasn't possible. She had seen it, lived in it, felt it. The doctor continued. "You were in a car accident on an empty road outside of town. There were no houses, no people." Claire's breath hitched, because suddenly, she wasn't sure if she had ever truly left. Weeks passed. Claire recovered, regaining her strength. Doctors called her survival a miracle. She never spoke of Brookhaven, never told them about the Miller house. They wouldn't believe her, but at night, when she closed her eyes, she still heard the whispers, still saw the shadows shifting at the edges of her vision. And sometimes, just sometimes, she swore she could still see it. Brookhaven, waiting for someone new to vanish.